can see it anytime in the audience by clicking attendees and participants box.
Yeah, I don't have the chat up. Now I can see the chat because I didn't have it open before. I have to click on it.
I've just started the live stream on YouTube, so
right
there as well. Yes, Cody, we can see the chat.
Okay, sorry. Didn't mean to click that. Sorry. There we go. Chat. So I see if I click on the chat, I can kind of move it over to the side. Cool. Cool. It says 5 participants down at the bottom. How many have you done since you've been in the States, Jonathan?
How many debates, or you mean how many webinars?
How many webinars?
I've done, I've only done a couple since moved to the States. I've been busy.
Yeah. You've been doing a lot of debates.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of debates. And I've also been busy with my work and in South Africa, Oxford, London, Europe. Katerina actually translated for me when I was in Austria.
I saw that. That was great. How long were you traveling?
We were traveling for 5 weeks. It was a really great time. Yep.
You like to travel, don't you?
I did.
I hate it.
Well, I don't like the process of traveling.
Okay.
I like being different places, but waiting on an airplane for 10 hours is not my favorite thing.
At least 10 hours, yeah.
And in fact, on Sunday, so our flight from Johannesburg to London was 10 hours, and then there's another 7 hours to get to Boston from London. So it was a long trek.
Wait, 7 hours to get what? To Boston. And then you were probably in the airport for a while in between there.
Yeah, we were. Yeah, for several hours. And then we arrived back in Boston Sunday night, and I was teaching Monday morning.
And completely jet lagged, of course.
I don't actually suffer from much jet lag. I'm pretty fine as far as jet lag is concerned.
How many hours different is South Africa?
It's currently 2 ahead of the UK, so it's like 7 hours different from here, from Boston.
And that does not bother you?
No.
Wow. Oh, you know what? I'm going to move this over a little bit. That'll help. Yeah, that's better. Yep. And I'm looking more into the camera.
I don't know if you saw any of the debate with Peter Atkins at all. Did you see any of that?
No, but now that wasn't the one today, right?
That was the one in Oxford. Peter Atkins is a physical chemist. He was formerly a professor at Oxford University. He's now retired. He turns 80 this year. And his performance was a bit of a train wreck.
Well, that's always sort of satisfying in a way. I mean, I don't mean to sound mean-spirited, but if you're debating an atheist, it's almost better if his performance is a train wreck.
Yeah, I prefer some more substantive engagement.
Okay, I see what you mean.
I do debates for 2 reasons. Two main reasons. One is to educate the audience and provide kind of a good starting point for further study.
Right.
I don't see debate so much as a win-lose type of deal. It's more I want to give the audience kind of the starting blocks, because especially if you're debating a scholarly opponent, you don't really have time in the 2.5 hours that are allotted for the debate to really drill down to the nitty-gritty.
Correct.
So with a scholarly opponent, you usually don't win the debate in the sense that it's really obvious to the lay audience that aren't familiar with all the relevant subjects. So that's one of the purposes, to provide a starting point for further study and to give an introduction to the debate. And the second purpose is to allow myself to put my arguments to the test and have them cross-examined by a learned opponent. so that and I find that I improve after every debate, because usually after a debate I think, oh, I should have made that point, or I should have made this point, and the next time that particular point comes up, then I remember from that previous experience that I should have brought up this point, and then I gradually improve. And also sometimes my opponents might find a weakness in an argument that I hadn't seen before, or they might come up with some additional point that I hadn't interacted with before, or given sufficient thought to, and so it helps me to do my research better and to make my arguments better over time. So.
But obviously, if it's a train wreck, it's not fulfilling that purpose, right? If his performance, yeah, I see what you mean. I won't do live debates. I have considered doing written debates. In fact, I've sometimes thought about it, and he might refuse, but challenging Bart Ehrman to a written debate. I wouldn't do a live debate with him. I mean, I remember when Tim was on the Unbelievable Show with Bart, and Tim did a great job, but Bart derailed it from the sensible topic. It was supposed to be on undesigned coincidences. They spent the whole first segment debating the authorship of the Gospels. Well, now, you know, fortunately, Tim.
I think they did 2 back-to-back debates. One was
they did. So they did get onto it, but it was never supposed to be about the authorship of the Gospels. Yeah. It was just that Tim was very you know, Tim has all this at his fingertips anyway, right? So he was able to do it, but he was frustrated with that subject change. And in a written debate, that's not as easy to do.
And with Bart Ehrman, that's frustrating because Bart Ehrman is such a sloppy scholar. Like you can literally go through his books and find tons of factual mistakes.
Correct.
Just with some resources for yourself. It's like, and they're not. Most of them are not mistakes that are difficult to actually see if you actually read the primary source. They're just really obvious mistakes. Like, for example, where was Jesus the day after his baptism? Well, according to Bart Ehrman, it depends which gospel you read, because in John chapter 1, the day after Jesus' baptism, John the Baptist sees him and says, "Behold the Lamb of God into the world." But in the Synoptics, immediately after his baptism, he's driven into the wilderness. The problem is that in John chapter 1, John the Baptist is merely, you know, recalling a previous episode, right?
Right. So he does that kind of thing all the time. Or I heard Rob Bowman point one out at Defend that Bart says that none of the gospel authors mention angels at the tomb. John mentions angel. He says angels. Angels, 2 angels in white. Yeah. So it's like you said, I mean, it's just like reputable. But who has time to, I mean, in a live debate, you can't hit all those points.
Yeah, and also in Luke 24, and Bart completely omits to mention this when he deals with the angels at the tomb in his book, Jesus Interrupted, that actually in Luke 24, the women interpret what they saw to the disciples, that they saw a vision of angels.
True, you've got a good point there too. But then he could try to quibble on that because in the narrative it doesn't say angels, but in John it actually says angels right in the narrative at the tomb.
And then another one he has is that John contradicts himself because he has the wedding at Cana in Galilee where Jesus turns the water into wine. This is the first of the miracles Jesus did. And then he performed many miracles, and then you've got the second miracle. But he doesn't mention the second part of these same verses, which mentions that it's the first miracle in Galilee, the second miracle in Galilee, and the ones in between were in Judea.
Yeah, so it says specifically the second miracle after coming out of Judea. That's really slimy. That one really bothers me because he's deliberately suppressing evidence. One of my favorites is that Jesus becomes God's son, he says, at his baptism. And he says that Luke says this because he says in Luke, the Father's voice says, "Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee." And I remember when Tim quoted that to me, I said, it doesn't say that in Luke. It doesn't say that. So you go look it up. Well, it turns out it's this, Tim calls it the Addams family text, you know, this monster text. I can't remember which one it is, but textual scholars do not treat this as a good, reliable text. It's not used for any of the modern translations. So some scribe imported "this day have I begotten thee" probably from Hebrews or from Psalm, whichever one that is. Yeah, Psalm 2. I was going to say Psalm 2. Right. And so it's a scribal addition, but he just quotes it. It's like in Luke, he becomes God's son at his baptism and doesn't tell his hearers that he's quoting a minority text.
Right. Yeah. Bart Ehrman is just a really sloppy scholar. And when you're debating Bart Ehrman, it's frustrating if he derails the debate onto a different topic.
Yep. It drove Tim crazy and inerrancy.
Yeah.
Because they had actually discussed that before the recording was clicked. And Tim had said something that like, no, look, let's not, this isn't about inerrancy. Let's discuss the reliability of the Gospels. The minute, it started with record on, he's like, are you an inerrantist? Blah, blah, blah. That was, like expressly something they had supposedly set aside.
I actually, on topic of inerrancy, I actually draw a distinction between what I call dogmatic inerrancy versus inductive inerrancy.
Right, I call it a priori versus inductive, yeah.
So I don't consider myself a dogmatic inerrantist in the sense that I don't consider myself committed to inerrancy on a priori basis.
Right.
So I think that perspective sets up by the biblical text to be very brutal, in the sense that if you knock out a single claim, the entire 66 books of the Bible, then the whole thing collapses like a house of cards. And
right.
I don't see that being the case.
You might not anger the inerrantists as much if you replace dogmatic with a priori, though. I mean, it sounds more technical, it doesn't sound like you're dissing them. Yeah. A priori, I'm not an a priori inerrantist, but I was just discussing this with a Facebook friend yesterday, or maybe the day before, that very distinction that you made. But I said, I wouldn't even call myself an inductive inerrantist, because right now I actually have certain places where I think there probably are some errors. So I want to be clear about that. And the funny thing about an inductive inerrantist is that in a sense you could be an inductive inerrantist about a completely secular document.
Right, exactly. Or a text, right? or something.
Text or something, right? You could say, well, in fact, this work doesn't have any errors in it.
Yeah. And I actually agree with you in the cases that you cite in your book, for cases where there are plausible errors in the Gospels. I think that a plausible explanation for those is that the one or more of the Gospel authors made a good faith mistake. I think it's important to be upfront about such things, rather than if we try and do gymnastics on cases where there is a plausible case for a good faith error, then I think we play into our hands.
Right, and the other thing is that if a scholar is going to say that he's following the evidence, I actually have this in one of my slides, but I was thinking of skipping that slide for time. But anyway, if a scholar says, look, I'm just a scholar, I'm just following the evidence, I'm not bound by a priori theological considerations, then he definitely ought to be willing to consider a good faith error. Mm-hmm. Because, the whole point is, okay, you're not bound by a priori theological considerations, then why are you skipping that option? Then there's no reason to skip that option at all.
Right. So I'm of the perspective that all Christians should affirm the reliability of Scripture, but should not be necessarily committed to a priori inerrancy.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And actually, I think that statements of faith should replace, inerrancy with reliability.
Yeah, but reliability is just being redefined now too. I'm sorry to say, pretty much you can redefine anything you want. Unfortunately, I'll be discussing concepts of concepts of reliability tonight. So I've got 2 cups of water and cough drops. So, okay, when do you want to get going here? Do you want to go up to a certain number of participants?
No, we can get started. I'll just go ahead and introduce you.
Okay, cool.
Welcome along to the Plaudits Academy, as the webinar series I run, where we discuss issues of interest to Christians, and we bring on different scholars, speakers, thinkers, etc., across the theological spectrum. And tonight we are very privileged to have with us Dr. Lydia McGrew, who's an analytic philosopher, and she's recently written a book called The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. And she basically lays out the case against a trend in contemporary New Testament scholarship, namely that the Gospels are Greco-Roman boii, and they felt themselves at liberty to invoke these compositional literary devices in the text, aka make things up or change things, or falsify information, or fictionalize details in the text. And so we're very honored to have Lydia with us. She's going to give us a presentation to begin with, and then we're going to open up to open floor Q&A and discussion. So I'll just turn over to Lydia. Thanks for being on.
Good evening, everybody. It's really great to be here. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for having me. It seems like it's been a long time, but Jonathan's been moving and traveling. My goodness, and I've been finishing up one book and starting another one. I'm going to go to share screen right now, and I'm going to get my PowerPoint here. There we go. There we go. So I'm titling my talk tonight, Literary Devices in the Gospels, Fact or Fiction. I want to say something at the outset. This particular talk is meant to be a kind of a ground clearing enterprise because there are a lot of misunderstandings about the literary devices that I'm discussing, that I'm opposed to, what I'm opposed to, what I'm not opposed to, and what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. It takes a surprising amount of time to clear that ground. And so I'm not going to have a lot of time in this talk tonight to get into positive evidence for the high, robust historical reliability of the Gospels. I will be mentioning various categories at the end and giving an example. If someone in the audience wants to have me, or someone who listens to this webinar later, if you want to have me on your show to discuss or to be interviewed about the reliability of the Gospels and to emphasize that positive evidence on that side, I am very happy to have that emphasis. Tonight, I'm emphasizing more the question of, what is incorrect about the literary device views and what they are and so forth. I'm willing to have that other emphasis. I would not be willing under those circumstances not to mention the literary device views or not to mention the name of a scholar that I disagree with, but you can certainly do a presentation that has a very different different emphasis, and where we're mostly doing positive evidence. So I just want you to know I do have that side as well. And I would also say, as I'll be discussing as I go on, anything that you think of as evidence for the historical reliability of the Gospels is, I will argue, evidence for what I call the reportage model. Now, others will disagree with that. They'll say, no, it isn't. But I would say inductively, it is. That's always going to be a non-deductive case. But yes, it is. So when you think in terms of the positive case, think of my earlier book, if you enjoyed that, if you're familiar with it, Hidden in Plain View, or other presentations you've heard, maybe from my husband Tim, on external confirmations, on design coincidences, and that sort of thing. All of that is tightly intertwined here. Now, why does this not want to progress? Oh, I see. That's how that works. Okay. The book, as Jonathan mentioned, that has just come out. This is a picture of the cover. This came out on December 10th, published by DeWard Publishing, is The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. The question I ask in this book is this: what are the four canonical Gospels? Are they a mirror of Jesus that reflects who he is by natural means, such as eyewitness testimony, or are they a mask that covers his face by the agenda or the changes that the author made? I will be addressing later in this talk a mixed view where someone wants to say, well, they're kind of in between, they're not either, but that's the meaning of the title. So I'm explaining the title in those terms. The first thing I want to talk about is, what kind of literary devices are we talking about? And this is important because the subtitle there cannot contain everything that I might want to say about this. You can't put everything in a subtitle. So, people are going to say, well, literary devices, what, like a metaphor or a parable or something? What possible problem could you have with literary, some kind of literary category in the Gospels? What are you, some kind of crazy fundamentalist? And the answer is no. So the literary devices that I'm arguing against in the Gospels are what I refer to as fictionalizing literary devices. Now that's a coined term that I've made. So we philosophers talk about what we call a stipulative definition of a term, where we have a term and then we stipulate what we mean by it. Very important to stick to that. Don't jump to what you think is meant by that. Now, these are not just a figure of speech in the language. Like when Jesus says, going through the eye, a camel going through the eye of a needle, obviously he doesn't mean that a camel could really go through the eye of a needle. Or when we in modern English say there was a light bulb in my head, or if Jesus said a certain man came down from Jericho, his audience understands that that is a parable. That's not what I'm talking about. So if you prefer to use the term fact-changing devices, that's fine. This is just a descriptive term. I will get into the question of deception later. That is not defined into the meaning of the term. In Craig Blomberg's book on the historical reliability of the Gospels, he uses the term fictitious narratives in approximately the same way. So it's just a descriptive term. Let's see what the characteristics are of these fictionalizing literary devices as I've defined them. First of all, very simple. What is narrated is contrary to fact in some respect. So this is just very straightforward. The narrative says that a person was there and that person wasn't really there in reality. The narrative indicates that something happened in this year or on this day. It didn't really happen on this day, etc. It's contrary to fact in some respect. Very, very straightforward meaning there. Second, this is very important. The change is invisible within the work in which it appears. The narration appears realistic. There is no tag in the text whereby even the original audience could objectively and non-conjecturally, that's important, distinguish fact from non-fact. Some of the scholars I'm answering will suggest that literally the audience engaged in some kind of conjectural comparative redaction criticism, where they had Mark and they had John, and they said, oh, look, John is different from Mark. I bet Mark is the historical one and John is, well, that's a conjecture, that's a guess. Okay. But if they just read John, it would look realistic. So it's not a parable. You know, Jesus' audience always knows when he's speaking in parables. His disciples can be pretty dense, but they know when he's talking in parables. There's no once upon a time. The literary device theorists are not offering you a decoder ring. And you put on your decoder ring, and then now I'm like an ancient person, and I read this passage and I say, oh, there's that word in the Greek that means the next 5 verses are not factual. There is nothing like that. That's not even claimed. That's not even part of the theory. The change is invisible within the work. Thirdly, and very importantly, please do not leave this out if you're characterizing my view, the change is deliberate. The author does not accidentally give a false impression. So this is, again, these are the devices I'm opposing. These are the devices I'm against, okay? So if you're characterizing what Lydia is opposed to, this is what Lydia is disagreeing with. Not something that has only one of these characteristics, not something that has only 2 of these characteristics, but things that have all 3 of these characteristics. So in this third characteristic, part of this literary device view is that the change is deliberate. The author's not just accidentally giving a false impression. The way he narrates, maybe somebody could have misunderstood. He's not just accidentally narrating ambiguously, and he's not even just making a good faith error. Rather, on the view I'm disagreeing with, the author is attempting to make it appear in his story that the event happened in a way that was contrary to fact. He's deliberately doing that. That's what I mean by a fact-changing or a fictionalizing literary device. I think it might be apparent already why this might be controversial. And if you heard about the views I'm against, or one of the scholars, perhaps Dr. Michael Licona or Craig Evans, Craig Keener, you may not have thought that those authors were ever advocating anything that fulfills all 3 of these characteristics. In fact, it might surprise you. You know, you might say, oh, she's got to be straw manning. I want to just point something out. It would not be possible to make these detailed changes in question unconsciously. when we get to specific examples, we can see this. And I'll give an example. In a debate with Bart Ehrman, Dr. Licona stated that Luke moved the first appearance of Jesus geographically from Galilee to Jerusalem. And that it really occurred in Galilee, the first appearance to his male disciples, and Luke moved it. He says that's part of Luke's compression, a geographical movement. And there are many indicators in Luke's text that this first appearance occurs in Jerusalem. He's absolutely explicit about it over and over again. So if he did this, he couldn't have done that in some sort of, trance state or something. He would have had to have gone in there and said, I'm going to put this in there about Emmaus being this far from Jerusalem, and they run back to Jerusalem. And while they're talking to the 11, Jesus appears among them to put this in Jerusalem. So please don't let anybody tell you, oh, maybe they just were doing this unconsciously or something. That just can't work for the examples in question. Now, you may again be wondering, could this be a misunderstanding, some kind of vast misunderstanding? Or could Lydia just be maliciously strawmanning? Or could Lydia just be trying to get a day in the sun or something by misrepresenting these authors? Well, I have many, many, many quotations in my book, in my online posts. I document all of this meticulously. Here are just a few. Here's one from Michael Licona's Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? Either he's talking about the foot anointing in Passion Week. Either Mark or John appear to have changed the day using synthetic chronological placement in order to bind the anointing explicitly to a different context than where it actually occurred. The event is presented as historical, but the stated chronology is artificial. Very explicit. Either Mark or John moved the day. They changed it to a different day in their narrative, in what Craig Keener calls the story world of the gospel. That's a phrase Keener uses in his commentary on John. Here's another quotation talking about the Last Supper. John appears deliberate in his attempts to lead his readers to think the Last Supper was not a Passover meal. But Licona argues that the Last Supper was a Passover meal. So he takes it that it appears that John has moved the day of the Last Supper so as to move the day of the crucifixion. This would be for symbolic or theological reasons. He appears deliberate in his attempts to lead his readers to think. Again, this meets my definition of a fact-changing literary device. You can disagree with me, and that's absolutely fine, but I am in fact representing what these authors are saying, and the terminology I'm using is just terminology. It's just stipulated terminology. Here's an interesting one, because this quotation emphasizes the importance of the ancient context and how this isn't just something we do nowadays. So that's a different claim we'll sometimes hear. Oh, we just do these things nowadays. Not the things I'm objecting to, we don't just do nowadays, but actually Licona himself is quite clear about this. Many who believe the biblical authors were divinely inspired also assume those authors must have written with the degree of accuracy and almost forensic precision we desire and expect today. However, this would require those authors to have stepped out of their culture. Fortunately, and this is important, historical nearsightedness can be corrected with the proper glasses. We craft the proper lenses by reading a significant amount of literature from the period, which improves our understanding of the genre to which the Gospels belong. Like anyone who begins to wear glasses, some initial discomfort and adjusting will occur. So I want to ask a question. If people want to say, oh, this is just what we all do all the time, then why will initial discomfort occur? Is it just because some people like Lydia are weird? I don't think so. If Dr. Licona is predicting initial discomfort on the basis of the fact that this is different, then the idea is that it's different. It's something different from what we do right now in honest, ordinary conversation. And it's supposed to be something new. It's and that again is very consistent with this fact-changing thing, because I would say that most people who at least conservatives, evangelicals, who approach the Gospels assume that the authors do not engage in fact-changing literary devices such as I have just defined. So of course they would experience discomfort if they were asked to change their view of the Gospels. Here's an interesting one. He was discussing the day when Jesus allegedly cursed the fig tree. This was in a dialogue with Richard Howe at SES in October. He had just been asked by Frank Turek, the moderator, whether this was intentional or not. Was it intentional or accidental? I think in the case of Matthew, the fig tree and the temple cleansing, I think it's intentional. Here's why. Now, I'm not going to read his reason, but it has to do with Matthew allegedly changing Peter remembered with the statement that the fig tree withered immediately. And then he goes on, so that would be a clue that would seem to suggest that Matthew intends for his readers to understand that it had withered on the spot. So again, contrary to fact, realistically narrated within the narrative, and deliberate, intentional. So here arises this very pertinent question. Does this make fictionalizing literary devices deception? Notice I haven't gotten to this question until now. I'm here now. That wasn't defined. The definition was entirely descriptive. Now we're going to evaluation and to the question of deception. Okay, so please, if you've heard someone saying, oh, this is terrible, how straw manning and how mean and how misrepresenting, they're saying that the gospel authors are deceptive. Well, I think that in fact, this would have de facto ended up being deception, but that's part of my argument. It's not my assumption. That's what I argue further after defining them in a completely descriptive way. So let's ask this question, does this or would this make them deceptive? Well, it would make them factually confusing because an audience member who failed, as he easily might, to guess that the narrative is non-factual at that point would have a false belief, and yet the author is still deliberately making the change. Now, that still doesn't fully answer the question because Dr. Licona makes an analogy to a biopic. He used the analogy of Apollo 13 as a movie in one of his presentations, and he uses the analogy in his book on page 6 of a movie based on true events. When I watched the movie Chariots of Fire, I assumed that the character Lord Lindsay existed, that he was a real person, and I was wrong about that. They more or less invented the character of Lord Lindsay, so I got a wrong impression. But that's just because I miscalibrated how much of the movie to take literally. I mean, we all do this when we watch biopics, and we may go away and we'll say, well, I think that part was probably real, but that part was probably made up. We make guesses all the time. But we know that some of it may be made up, and then we can just make mistakes about that, but we don't mind. Why? Because we figure, well, I just didn't take enough of it with a grain of salt. The theorists consider, as I've hinted, that the changes do not count as deception because of the gospel genre. So we can avoid false beliefs in watching a biopic, and according to the theorists, the original audience could avoid false beliefs if they just adjusted their expectations sufficiently when reading the Gospels. But I want to just point out at this point that this does have implications for the Gospel's reliability, because in adjusting your expectations, just as you do when you walk into a movie that's based on true events, you don't expect them to be all that accurate. You say, well, I figured they did change some things. You don't know what all they changed. You may look it up later. But it's precisely by lowering your expectations for reliability that you avoid considering yourself deceived. So that genre claim that's protecting the authors from the charge of deception, or it's supposed to protect them from the charge of deception, is pulling against high and robust reliability for the Gospels. There's a reason why we don't use Chariots of Fire as an original source for the events of the 1924 Olympics. We try to go back to other original sources, but the Gospels supposedly are our original sources. The genre is incredibly important in all of this. Dr. Licona says, the majority of New Testament scholars agree that, at minimum, the Gospels share much in common with the genre of Greco-Roman biography. Therefore, it should be of no surprise to observe the gospel authors using the compositional devices that were part and parcel of that genre. In fact, we should be surprised if we did not observe it. It's an extremely strong statement. We should be surprised if we did not observe it. Of course, that makes sense if you think they were in this genre. I mean, if I say that something is a movie based on true events, then I do expect them to change things. Same interview. Where I differ from most evangelicals is I place a priority on genre over harmonization. So before seeking to harmonize gospel facts or gospel texts, one should read the gospels in view of their biographical genre, which includes their author's use of the various compositional devices commonly used when writing history and biography. Now, these quotations right here tell us something about the frequency with which the theorists suggest we should expect such changes. They're part and parcel. We should be surprised if we don't observe them. They were commonly used. If this is a genre, you would not expect just one. You don't go to a movie based on true events. You don't go to a biopic and say, well, I bet they just changed one thing. Of course not. You expect them to change more. You may not know how much. You may not know how far they went. You may decide that later if you happen to have an interest in doing so. But I'm going to come back to this later, this idea that we can say, well, maybe it's just a couple. That would be unreasonable if this genre claim is true. This crucial claim about genre is much more complex than its proponents seem to realize, and therefore it carries a very large burden of proof. And think about this. This is supposed to be an understanding that the authors of the Gospels have, and this is supposed to be an understanding that their audience has. That's why they're not deceiving them. I'm going to keep coming back to this. Of course, early Christians to whom the gospel authors wrote were a diverse lot. You had Jews, Gentiles, slave and free, men and women, more educated, less educated. Why is it that in our culture we expect everyone to understand that something's just a movie? Well, because most of us have gone to movies since we were little kids, right? At least in America and other first world countries. And maybe you were a little kid and the parents said, no, this is just a movie, honey, when you go in, right? It gets passed down. It's in the air. It's in the water, as it were, and it gets passed down in informal ways. If you're really saying that this genre in which the authors were expected to make these changes, invisible, deliberate, factual changes here and there, was just understood in Asia Minor, in first century Palestine, among Jews and Gentiles, bond and free, and by the authors of the Gospels themselves. So everybody was cool with it and didn't go in with their expectations too high. You're going to have a lot of work to do to show that. I want to make some vital distinctions at this point. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one claim that has come up since my book was released is that no, this isn't something that requires a lot of esoteric knowledge. A mutual friend of Dr. Lacona's and mine, Tom Gilson, wrote a column in which he raised the concern that this would require expert advice to try to figure out which parts of the Gospels were and were not historical. But then the response was, no, this is just how we do things in ordinary discourse nowadays. Well, I would go so far as to say that the things that I am disagreeing with, not a single one is something that honest people do in ordinary discourse, just ordinary conversation nowadays. And I also would say that's in tension with the earlier quotation about crafting new glasses and so forth, because you wouldn't need to do that if these things to which I am objecting were merely the things we do all the time. But you can understand better both what I'm saying and why there is this burden of proof if you make some vital distinctions. First one is what I call achronological versus dyschronological narration. I've coined these words, however, the concepts are not new. What may be new is the intent and the attempt to use them consistently and to bring them up over and over again. Well, which one are you talking about there? Which one are you talking about there? And so forth. So let's think about achronological narration, I'm going to actually start with compression. If I said, I went to the store and I wrote a lot on my book, and I'm just talking about stuff I did recently, you might assume that I'm talking about a single day, but I'm not just talking about a single day. Maybe I mean that on Monday I went to the store, and on Tuesday I wrote a lot on my new book. Now, you might accidentally get the wrong impression, but remember, that's not fact changing. It was just an accident. Or take the end of Luke's gospel. This is probably an even better example. At the very end in Luke 24, he's very precise up to a certain point about what's happening on what day, but you get to about verse 44, and suddenly he says, and he opened to them the scriptures, and he led them out to Bethany, and and so forth. In other words, he just starts saying, and the word I believe is de in the Greek, which the late scholar John Wenham, he said, would be better to not even translate. Please don't translate it. He said, don't translate it as then, which makes it sound like it all happened on the same day. He said it doesn't indicate that it all happened on the same day. So that would be achronological compression or telescoping. The author is not giving a chronology. That's why I call it achronological. He's not trying to make it look like it took a shorter time. Dyschronological compression is what Dr. Lacona and Dr. William Lane Craig both think happened at that point, which is that Luke actually put those events all on Easter Day. That Luke in his gospel, though not in Acts, tries to, in a sense, make it in the story all happen on Easter Day. That's dyschronological compression. Same way for displacement. Suppose that I were talking about yesterday, and I said, yesterday I wrote a chapter of my book and I made supper. Notice I just said and. Suppose I actually wrote only after supper. Well, I didn't say I wrote a chapter of my book and then after that I made supper. Now, if I did that, that would be dyschronological displacement, that I'm changing the time when it happened. I'm not objecting to a chronological change. In fact, it's something we do all the time. But that's not fact changing. It's not fact changing because you're not giving a chronological fact. So you can't be changing the facts, just by definition. Okay. Non-fact changing transferal versus fact changing transferal. Suppose I say, George asked me to borrow $50. And George sent our mutual friend Bob, because he thought Bob would get the money off me better, to ask to borrow it. That could be non-fact changing transferal. Maybe I just don't feel like going into all the details. And by the way, you'll sometimes hear the phrase, the guy version. Guys just like to hit the bullet points, and Lydia just objects to the guy version. Actually, no, I don't just object to the guy version. Non-fact changing transferal, just simplifying the narrative, leaving something out, that is very common. But on the other hand, suppose I say, George came to me and he looked very worried. And I make a little dialogue, and I said, George, what's the matter? And he said, I'm really having financial trouble. And I said, would $50 help? And he said, yes, it will. And George never came to me personally. That would be fact-changing transferal. And certainly in the genre of ordinary conversation, that would be lying. That would be deception. I don't care if the people involved are male or female or whatever. In the genre of ordinary conversation, that would be deception. Maybe in a biopic, you might make up a scene like that or something, but this is not something we just do in ordinary conversation. I'm going to give another example here. Suppose you went to a conference and you came back and you said to your friend, I had a great conversation with William Lane Craig at Defend 20 in New Orleans, and he told me he was praying for me. And then later your friend goes and finds out that William Lane Craig was not at Defend 20, which as far as I know, he wasn't. And your friend gets a little puzzled and he comes back and he says, were you maybe confusing Defend with ETS? Because Bill was at the ETS. And you're both guys, and you say to your friend, no, I talked with his graduate student at Defend, and his graduate student brought a message to me that Bill said he was praying for me. So I made Bill come in person to Defend. It's just what we guys do in conversation, right? I somehow think that your friend would not say, oh, you're right, of course, no problem. Of course not. He would have really understood you to say that you had a personal conversation. All right. Paraphrase. This is a biggie. You will hear the word paraphrase used in very odd ways. Also, the word ipsissima vox. I've already spent long enough on this slide, so I'll be brief about it. But paraphrase needs to be recognizable in order for the word paraphrase to apply meaningfully. If Jesus said in reality, in history, the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins, as in Mark, and he did that in Galilee in the context of healing a lame man. But he never recognizably said, in Jerusalem, I and the Father are one, as recorded in John. And John was inspired, as it were, to make him say, I and the Father are one, because after all, it's a claim to deity, and a claim to forgive sins is a claim to deity. That is not paraphrase. That is invention. It's theologically inspired invention, but it's not paraphrase. The word paraphrase is used in highly non-standard ways. I was asked in a debate with Dr. Craig Evans. I would ask, does Lydia believe in paraphrase? I said, yes, I've seen it done. But that doesn't mean that I believe in calling things paraphrase that are not paraphrase. And those things need to be distinguished. I want to give some examples. I've given some already, so I'll move past some of these quickly. These are examples of actual factual changes that are alleged. I can give you citations for every single one of these. This just again shows you, I'm not making this up, alleged factual changes by the theorists. John allegedly changed the year when Jesus cleansed the temple. This is very popular. This is not just an extreme one that only one person holds, and well, I wouldn't go that far. No, and this is supposed to be dyschronological narration that Jesus only cleansed the temple once late in his ministry, and John moved it too early in his ministry. I already mentioned this one, putting all the events on Easter Sunday, moving the first appearance to Jerusalem. I want to note right here, this one has apologetic implications. If you're defending the resurrection of Jesus Christ, one point you may sometimes say is the disciples weren't expecting to see Jesus when they first saw him. Well, if we say that it was really like Matthew narrates it, and that was the first one, Matthew says they went to a mountain in Galilee that Jesus had told them of. So they went there expecting to see him. If that's really the first appearance, then you can no longer say that at the first appearance they weren't expecting to see him. Doubting Thomas is extremely difficult to fit in if we say that it first took place in Galilee. Now, the sheer geographical move is not trivial. That's like at least a 3 days walk. It's a big deal. It's 70 miles at least. And it has all these other implications. I do not think Doubting Thomas was going to walk to Galilee and then somehow he wasn't with them the first time and then he was with them again. These things ramify, they're intertwined, and that's because reality is intertwined. And that's because the real narratives are intertwined. You can't just snip something out and declare it trivial and say it's trivial because I say it's trivial, move along. So this actually has other implications. Here's one alleged by Michael Licona and Dan Wallace. John allegedly invented Jesus saying, I thirst from the cross is a dynamic equivalence for the saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Dr. Wallace, followed by Dr. Licona, argues that this was somehow similar metaphoric meaning because forsakenness was a spiritual forsakenness and therefore a spiritual thirst. In John, of course, they run and they actually get wine to give him when he says, I thirst. So John is definitely portraying this as a literal event, but somehow John had no trouble with that, doing that, because he just knew that he was, it was secretly in his own mind, this was not literal and this hadn't really happened. Now you'll hear people saying, well, I wouldn't go that far. Well, how far would you go? What about some of these others? John allegedly changed the day of Jesus' crucifixion. That's another very popular one. Been writing about it recently in my book on John, which is my next book. Here's one. Matthew allegedly invented a healing of the blind early in Jesus' ministry as a doublet. This is suggested as a possibility by Michael Licona, but he doesn't affirm it. Definitely, he just says, well, maybe this. But however, in his commentary on Matthew, Greg Keener does affirm this. So please bear this in mind next time someone says there are limits to what this genre allowed, and it's helpful to reliability, and ancient biographers did not consider themselves permitted to invent incidents. I would definitely say some of these count as inventing incidents, and we shouldn't quibble too much about what counts as incidents. Another one described by, endorsed by Craig Keener, is that Matthew allegedly invented additional blind men to compensate for not telling other stories about healing blind men found in Mark. He mentions this again in Christobiography, or very briefly references it. It was originally, I believe, in his Matthew commentary. So that's interesting. So you've got a certain number of, I call them blind men game tokens. And, so here's a blind man, he's healed over, here in Mark in a totally different story. And here's one blind man, he's healed over here. And then Matthew says, oh, I'm not going to tell that story, but I still want to have two blind men. So I'll take this blind man and I'll sort of move the game token over here and say that there were two blind men healed in this context here. Again, there are limits. Okay. What are they? And many, many more. Many of these are what I call utterly unforced errors. An utterly unforced error is a scholar raising a theory when there is not even an apparent contradiction. So, for example, with I thirst, there's no contradiction between Jesus saying I thirst and saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? You could easily have said both. So you're just raising this, I would say, out of the blue. This shows that these theories are not confined to a narrow set of cases. Well, that makes sense with a genre claim. There's this great coherence to the views when you really understand them. If it's a genre, then you wouldn't expect it to just arise where there's a discrepancy or an apparent discrepancy. You would expect it to arise in other places as well. Dr. Licona suggests out of the blue that John the Baptist may not have called himself the voice of one crying in the wilderness, but that John the evangelist may have transferred that to him. Transferred it from whom? Isaiah. And he says it's impossible to know. He says there is no reason why John the Baptist could not have made such a claim. So he acknowledges there's no reason why this couldn't have happened. It's not even improbable, but then he just says it is impossible to know whether John the Baptist really did. Why would it be impossible to know? If John the evangelist is a reliable narrator, and this isn't even a miracle. I mean, even if you think miracles are things that require extra evidence or something, this is just John the Baptist saying something. And in the case of I thirst, it's very probable Jesus would have been very thirsty on the cross. So why cast doubt on this? Why say it's impossible to know? Well, I would say because functionally, you are not treating John's narrative as having very much evidential worth. He narrates that John the Baptist says that, and then you go, oh, well, maybe not. Okay, so that takes us to the question of reliability. I'm going to give several different concepts of reliability here. I'm going to spend some time on this because I think gospel reliability is something we care about, something Christians care about. If this is new to you, and if you don't think I'm just lying or ignorantly misunderstanding in some vast, strange way in my presentation thus far, you may already see that this has implications for reliability. Unfortunately, not everyone agrees. So I'm going to spell this out a little bit. First of all, there's what I call the minimal reliability condition. This is an area of my specialty in epistemology, the theory of knowledge. This is that the assertion of a fact by a source by itself provides some evidence that the proposition is true. So these are all what we call epistemic reliability. They're facts about what's rational, what rational attitude we should have toward an assertion. So this minimal, very minimal condition is that it's some evidence at least. High reliability. The assertion of a fact by the source by itself provides quite strong evidence that the proposition is true. Now, this could be defeasible. All right, you might have evidence to the contrary, but at least in itself, that assertion is quite strong evidence. It would require defeat. So notice that in the case of the voice of one crying in the wilderness, there isn't anything to defeat that. So obviously, Dr. Licona is not treating John's gospel as having high reliability at that point, because without even any defeat, without even any counter evidence, he's just saying it is impossible to know whether John invented this saying for John the Baptist. If you require multiple attestation for some given incident in the Gospels, you are not treating the individual source as significantly reliable. This is true of things other than the Gospels too. If I read something or I listen to what somebody says and I say, well, maybe not, I'm not going to believe that unless I find someone else saying it as well, I must not have a very high reason to trust that person or that source unless, there's just something intrinsically bizarre about what he says. But if it's what we might just call a garden variety statement, he says, so-and-so said this, and I say, well, I'm going to wait and see if that's multiply attested, I think your friend would be hurt if you said that. You're not treating him as significantly reliable. Important thing to just bear in mind, there sometimes seems to be some confusion about this. Source reliability does not merely mean that a source contains true information. We sometimes informally use the phrase reliable information. Informal use, we don't necessarily get hung up about, but we do want to be precise. It's better to talk about a reliable source than reliable information. Strictly speaking, information is true or false. So a stopped clock is right twice a day, but that doesn't make the stop clock reliable. If it is possible to mine out or get out true information from a document by itself, that doesn't make that document reliable. In fact, you can do that with unreliable sources as well. Licona repeatedly uses phrases such as it is impossible to tell. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 page citations right here. Impossible to tell, impossible to know, impossible to discern whether an author changed the facts or who did so. I think this has implications for reliability. Again, it fits with the genre claim. If you accept that these are the kinds of authors and documents that we have, you do not have any good reason to believe that there are only 1 or 2 trivial changes per document. In fact, the genre claim would lead you rationally to expect more. You should expect more. So the image of Jesus, the picture of Jesus, is covered by a redactive fog. I believe it was my husband, Tim, who first came up with the phrase redactive fog, which I love. But I'm not sure if he came up with it. It's a great phrase, a redactive fog. And that's what I mean by the mask. Deliberate change has an especially strong effect upon reliability. This is certainly related to the issue of inerrancy. And you can ask me questions about inerrancy in the Q&A if you want to. I do not consider myself an inerrantist, but there is a difference between a deliberate and a non-deliberate change. If you were on a jury and the witness said that an event happened on Wednesday, upon cross-questioning, he was forced to acknowledge that it happened on Saturday. Now our scenarios diverge. In scenario 1, the witness says, I am so sorry. We went to the same restaurant on those 2 nights, and I just forgot and I got it confused. Yes, you're right. It was on the other day. In the other scenario, he says, oh, I knew all along it was on the other day. I changed that on purpose. It was a literary device. I did it to make a better story. I ask you in honesty to consider which of these has a stronger effect upon your confidence, your ability to rely upon that witness's testimony. And I want to say something here The concepts of reliability, even high reliability I was talking about in the earlier slide, are not just idiosyncratic things that I'm concerned about. I think they're things that a lot of believers are rightly concerned about. So a good faith error actually does not have as strong of an influence upon the ability to rely upon the rest of what that witness says. We can talk maybe more in Q&A about why that is. The confirmation of the Gospels often does depend upon details. If you liked my earlier book, Hidden in Plain View, and if you haven't, please get a copy. I talked there about an argument called the argument from undesigned coincidences. This depends upon the confirmation of small details. In The Mirror or the Mask, I have discussions of external confirmations based upon small details. My husband Tim has talks out there about external confirmations based upon incidental details. So often you'll hear, well, this doesn't matter, it's just the details, the gist is true. I think several of the changes I just discussed go beyond changing the gist anyway, but often confirmation does depend upon details. If the details are expected to be changed, we should not expect them to be confirmed, but they are. So that means that it doesn't look like they were changed. Evidence goes both ways. I have a chapter, one of my very favorite chapters, and it was my proofreaders, one of my proofreaders' favorite chapters too. In The Mirror or the Mask, it's called Evidence and the Artless Author. And what I do there is I take various items of positive evidence for the Gospels, and I show how they would be evaluated differently by the literary device theorist and by the person who takes, as I do, more seriously the complete honesty of the evangelists. And it's a very fascinating exercise. The confirmation of Jesus' physical resurrection depends upon details. I have another webinar with Apologetics Academy, please look it up, called Minimal Facts versus Maximal Data, where I talk about the importance that Jesus ate with his disciples. He could be touched. He met with them on multiple occasions. Skeptics like Thomas saw him and so forth. As I mentioned before, they weren't expecting to see him the first time. This is all part of the cumulative case for the resurrection. So I don't think we should accept too readily the idea that it doesn't matter if the authors changed details. So are these theories true? We should not assume that this doesn't matter. Please don't let anyone tell you, don't worry about it, it doesn't matter anyway. Now, if your initial response is, well, this doesn't sound plausible at all, I would certainly agree with you. We can't all investigate everything. Life is short. But if you are inclined to say, well, these are experts, I think I'll just take their word for it, that's when, you definitely need to go and investigate it. And, everyone I encourage to investigate it because these are contemporary theories that are popular. But please, whatever you do, don't say, I'm not going to bother investigating it because it's not important, it doesn't matter. I argue in The Mirror or the Mask that support for the widespread acceptance of fact-changing literary devices and their use in the Gospels depends upon blurring crucial distinctions that I've already discussed, misunderstanding the ancient documents, and often rejecting reasonable harmonization of the texts. I want to discuss a few more methodological problems. Often what is used both in the secular and the gospel literature is a method that I call discrepancy hunting. So you find an apparent discrepancy and you just jump over all other possible explanations and you say it's a literary device. In secular literature, this is especially astonishing because, why not say the author might have made a mistake, for example? But the discrepancy, it just triggers that literary device claim. That's not good methodology. And I'm not saying this for a theological reason. I'm saying this historically. That's not good methodology. Cold case detective J. Warner Wallace, speaking of these theories in an interview, said if you took that approach with the cases I work, you'd never solve a case because you will see differences between authors. This is just what eyewitness testimony looks like. And he means not because of literary devices. He specifically says there's not some genre of eyewitness testimony in the 1970s when he's working on a cold case. This is not due to fact changing literary devices. It's due to ordinary things like difference of perspective. So one person sees only, literally visually sees only one thing and says it, so they supplement one another. Ordinary error, sometimes lying. By the way, lying's not a literary device. It's important to know. So it's due to ordinary causes that are not fact-changing literary devices. I want to talk right now, and I didn't do this at Defend, but it's been brought up to me since then, about something that I call a smorgasbord approach. Oh, it looks like I didn't tier this one. So you've got the entire slide up there so you can read the whole thing. Oh, well, I made these next two slides all at once recently. So in a smorgasbord approach, the theorist says, well, I don't want to go as far as some of these theorists do with some of these. I don't like the I thirst one. I don't like this one, but I like the one about the temple cleansing. And I don't want to prioritize genre over harmonization. I'm going to flip those. And so I'm going to first try to harmonize. And then if I can't harmonize, or I think I can't harmonize, then I'll go with a literary device. Well, first of all, that's discrepancy hunting, which is a bad method because there are other possible explanations. But second of all, I've argued that these devices didn't exist and that the gospel authors weren't using them. If the gospels are not written in a genre in antiquity that the audience understood, that they just expected that this kind of thing would crop up, then you do have a deception problem. So I think that the smorgasbord theorist who wants to retain just one or two here or there and doesn't want to bother challenging this claim about genre, but at the same time doesn't really want to think too much about whether Lydia has refuted it, he has a deception problem. Because if it is, it's a dilemma. If it is in that genre, you don't expect just a couple. And so then your smorgasbord is getting to be more and more and more fact-changing literary devices. And if it isn't in that genre, then they were deceivers. So which is it? I would also say this produces a psychologically highly improbable author. When people say that the Gospels are reliable and that the authors are being reliable, I think they mean they're trying to be truthful. What kind of confidence would you have in a friend who at random intervals and invisibly to you threw in made up stuff that never happened? You'd be like, well, he only does it 25% of the time or something. It's not what you usually mean when you say, I trust my friend. And it's not the way we think about it when we are trying to learn to trust someone. It's not using induction. When you get induction over and over again, well, looks like he's telling the truth, he's telling the truth, he's telling the truth. Eventually we conclude that this is a very, very truthful person. Maybe under some kind of intense duress, he might tell a lie, but it's not just changing the facts is not some kind of thing that he just considers himself licensed to do. So, if you want to make up a John who is very, very scrupulous sometimes and tells all these details just as they happened, and then one fine day he's writing about the temple cleansing or Jesus' crucifixion, and he says, I will move this to this other place at this other time because it's just so cool to make this theological point. I'm telling you that's an improbable person. That's not the way you would evaluate the evidence in ordinary life. And then I just want to emphasize that an ancient author writing in a partially non-historical genre is not bound to limit his changes to those that you feel comfortable with, or even to those where you think there is an irresolvable discrepancy. Think about this. The ancient author isn't just doing this because he knows it's going to have a discrepancy with some other ancient author. He's doing it because in his own genre, he considers himself licensed to do that. So there's no reason to limit these only to the ones where you have a discrepancy or an apparent discrepancy. You're not satisfied with any of the harmonizations. Why limit in that way? That is epistemically unreasonable and unprincipled. How do you therefore know where else such changes may have occurred? This is what Tom Gilson meant when he talked about pastoral implications. And I just want to say here, I think pastors care, and they should care. Don't try to tell a pastor that it doesn't matter if Matthew changed the facts, because it's still a close enough story. Because I think a pastor who respects the gospel and respects himself and respects his congregation is going to tell you, yes, it matters. He wants to get it right. He doesn't want to tell his audience to base their lives upon something that didn't happen. I'm actually going to skip this in the interest of time. I can talk more about this in Q&A. I've already mentioned that I don't consider myself an inerrantist, and you may have seen it. I don't know if this was already recording, but I did say something about this to Jonathan ahead of time. If you're just following the argument with no theological axe to grind, then you certainly should consider good faith error. Now I want to get to the evidence. Yes, we're right, going along in time here. This is great stuff, though, and I really appreciate Jonathan's generosity with time. This is ancient evidence. I go through countless of these in, well, not countless, you could probably count them, but in the Mirror of the Mask, many, and I hit every category of evidence that has been alleged to support these. Here is just one Plutarch example, because Dr. Lacona will say he finds these in Plutarch. So here's just one. In the Life of Caesar, written by Plutarch, a man named Scipio introduces a motion in the Roman Senate that Caesar should be considered a public enemy if he does not disarm by a certain date. That would be disarming, getting rid of his legions. And Lentulus in the Senate, that's a different guy, said that arms are needed against a bandit. So they're trash talking Caesar, but these two different people are saying different things. Caesar's having conflicts, let's just say, with this Roman Senate. In A Different Life by Plutarch, the life of Pompey, a guy named Marcellus says both of these things. He calls Caesar a robber, and he urges that he be voted a public enemy if he does not disarm. Okay, so he says both of them. Here's what Lacona says. Plutarch appears to conflate the logia uttered against Caesar by Scipio and Lentulus and transfer them to Marcellus. This would be fact-changing transferal. No motive is even suggested, and notice this isn't a relationship where one person's carrying a message for someone else. This is just, oh, I'm going to have this guy say it now. Why think a thing like that? And I want to just say here, there's nothing hidden here. You can go read this passage. This is not esoteric. It's a matter of reading this historical document and asking yourself if this is a reasonable conjecture. In a deliberative body, one person introduces a motion and another person supports it. This happens all the time. It happens in our Senate, happened in the Roman Senate. One person introduces this motion about Caesar being declared a public enemy, and then in A Different Life of Caesar, Plutarch records that somebody else supported it. In a heated political climate, multiple people say the same insulting thing about an opponent. I think we in the United States are familiar with this right now, especially with some current events that have been going on. I think we have definitely seen people say the same insulting things about a political opponent. The idea that we should take it that Plutarch is transferring this to a different person just because they're different names rather than all of these things happening is extreme. These scenarios are not improbable. They're normal scenarios. They're probable scenarios. This is the method of discrepancy hunting at work. I'm going to talk about another evidential problem that I turned up in my extremely time-consuming research. Craig Keener, in a couple different places in his commentary on John and also in his recent Christobiography, he gives the strong impression that St. Augustine endorsed dischronological narration. Now, he doesn't say that in so many words, but he gives that very strong impression. In one, the context is the moving of the temple cleansing. In the other, the context is the alleged changing of the day when Jesus cursed the fig tree. And Craig Keener does believe that John moved the temple cleansing dyschronologically. And he says, as noted in the introduction, chapter 1, ancient readers did not expect ancient biographies to adhere to chronological sequence. And then in Christobiography, and in both places, he mentions Augustine suggested the evangelists wrote their gospels as God recalled the accounts to their memory. So this implies, and you would take away from it, that Augustine thought since they did it as God brought it to their memory, dyschronological narration was okay. Well, but this is not distinguishing dyschronological from achronological. Now, when you go to the context where Augustine does say that they narrated as God brought things to their memory, here's what he says. When the order of times is not apparent, we ought not to feel it a matter of any consequence what order any of them may have adopted in relating the events. That's achronological narration. But whenever the order is apparent, if the evangelist then presents anything which seems to be inconsistent with his own statements or with those of another, we must certainly take the passage into consideration and endeavor to clear up the difficulty. This is in his Harmony of the Gospels. So he is rejecting dyschronological narration. The only alternative to achronological narration when there's an apparent discrepancy is that you must endeavor to clear up the difficulty. He doesn't even contemplate that you would say, oh, one of them changed it. Okay, he's just, and this is what he means when he says they narrated as the Spirit brought it to mind, that they sometimes narrated achronologically. That is taking that out of context to take that to mean dyschronological. I have a chapter called Let Ancient People Speak for Themselves in my book, and it's fun. It's full of a lot of quotations. Many of these citations I got from a very useful paper by Darrell Bach that is mostly just composed of quotations. I'm not saying Darrell Bach agrees with me about everything I'm saying here, but it was a very useful paper. It had a lot of useful quotations. So I went and looked them all back up, of course, myself, and I give him credit in the book. This one I found myself, however. This is from an author named Julius Africanus. He, not a modern guy. He lived from about 160 to 240. He's talking about a theory at the time to reconcile the alleged discrepancies between the genealogies that said that Matthew or Luke might have made up some of the names. And he's just furious about this. For if the generations are different and trace down no genuine seed to Joseph, and if all has been stated only with the view of establishing the position of him who was to be born, there being at the same time no proof given, but the dignity of the words being brought down to a feeble hymn, it is evident that no praise accrues to God from that, since it is a falsehood, but rather judgment returns on him who asserts it, because he vaunts an unreality as though it were reality. So one thing at least you can say when you read these many quotations that I have, Richard Burridge will say the ancients generally had a different view of truth from ours. And he'll attribute to them a view of truth such that literal factual truth was not really that important. And he will use that to put what I call an asterisk next to John the Evangelist's use of the word truth. And, I'm here to tell you, there are lots and lots of ancients, and I think we have reason to believe the gospel authors were among them, who cared about truth in a perfectly ordinary sense of truth, and a literal sense of truth, just as Julius Africanus does here. Please do not believe that there is just some generally different ancient view of truth, and then we have to say, oh yeah, John says truth, but maybe he doesn't really mean truth, maybe he means truthiness or something. There's no reason to think that. Now you may ask, well, what's the alternative? If we don't adopt these literary devices, what do we do? I call the alternative the reportage model. Please don't accept any straw men of the reportage model. Please bear in mind the distinctions I made earlier, and that I'm not rejecting achronological narration or recognizable paraphrase or non-fact changing transferal and these kinds of things. The reportage model is supported by many lines of evidence, and I get into these in the book. This is also supported by hidden in plain view. It's supported by pretty much anything you've ever heard that is accurate about the reliability of the Gospels. We also have the evidence of the Gospel author's own intentions, the things they themselves said about what they were trying to do. We have the evidence of the Christian context. That's something the late Leon Morris talks a lot about, is the importance of Christianity as a historical religion. Douglas Moo talked about this as well when he answered Robert Gundry back in the 80s. There's also positive evidence from what are called undesigned coincidences, what are called unexplained allusions, unnecessary details, unique personalities. I talk about the personality of Peter in The Mirror of the Mask. I'm going to talk about Jesus' personality in my new book, forthcoming book, The Eye of the Beholder, and incidental external confirmations. I want to give one unexplained allusion right here, because this is a category people don't hear about a whole lot. In John's Gospel, he introduces the passage where John the Baptist says he must increase and I must decrease, by saying that there was a dispute between the disciples of John the Baptist and the disciples of Jesus about purification. Excuse me, not the disciples of Jesus, a Jew and the disciples of John the Baptist about purification. He doesn't say who this Jew was. And the disciples of John the Baptist came to John the Baptist, who would have been their rabbi, and they say, and what you expect them to say is, here's the dispute we're having, etc. How would you answer it? And instead, what they say is, the one to whom you testified beyond the Jordan, he is baptizing and all men are coming to him. They're speaking of the baptizing ministry that Jesus' disciples are having at that time. In other words, we never hear what the dispute was about purification. Now, I'm going to say right now, as a literature specialist, that makes bad fiction. It's not how you write good fiction, not even modern realistic fiction. But it's really great reportage. Because if you talk to somebody, they will often introduce something that's a little bit irrelevant, but they're just introducing it because they want to go somewhere else. And then they don't go back and explain it, and they don't get off on some big rabbit trail. So from John the Evangelist's perspective, the dispute with the Jew about purification is just kind of how he files this statement, and this wonderful statement that John the Baptist makes, he must increase, but I must decrease. And he wants to get on to that. This is a mark of honest, truthful eyewitness testimony. And I emphasize again that if you're being principled and inductive in an epistemic way, when you have a lot of evidence of these many kinds, you should start considering that the gospel authors are just honest across the board and that they never change things. They never invent things. And you should consider that confirmed. Confirmation is not going to be deductive. It's going to be cumulative and inductive and non-deductive, but it is still possible to be irrational when you make unprincipled exceptions and say, well, maybe they just sometimes did it, or something like that. Unless you have very strong evidence that they made those changes deliberately, and I do mean deliberately, and that's going to be really hard to show, by the way, then when you have evidence that they're honest, I think you should conclude that they're always honest. Let me also say this. I've heard people ask, it's come up a number of times, what if I'm an inerrantist and I have a discrepancy and I'm just not happy with any of the harmonizations? What am I supposed to do? What do I do? And I think that's attracted a number of inerrantists to the literary device view. And I would ask in response to that, what would Lisa Narcher do? What would Vern Poythress do? Okay, and I think Vern Poythress is an especially good example here, because Poythress often talks about the fact that God in the Gospels doesn't always give us complete information. In his writings on the inerrancy of Scripture, he emphasizes this quite a bit. What did the older inerrantists do? I'll let you think about that for a second. You know what they did? They said, I don't know. And they were tough-minded enough to handle that, because they had a definition of inerrancy. They knew what it meant. They didn't think they were gaining something by changing the definition to keep the word. So they said, well, if I say that the author, if you had confronted them with this, and of course, Dr. Geisler was confronted with the idea, the author changed it on purpose. That's not what I meant by inerrancy anyway. So there's no gain to me from that. So they would just say, I have a few things. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the explanation is. That's what you do. If you're an inerrantist, you don't always have to have something to say about everything. You don't always have to have a label to slap onto something or a confident answer to give. It's better to have that tough-mindedness. Okay, for more, see the mirror or the mask. Also see hidden in plain view. If you want to contact me, by the way, you can order either of these via dward.com or amazon.com or wherever books are sold, Barnes & Noble and so forth. Please follow my public content on Facebook. You do not have to be a Facebook friend. Please don't be offended if I don't click confirm on your Facebook friend request. I just leave many of those unconfirmed. It's not an insult. Please don't take it personally. You don't really want to know what I had for supper yesterday, so it's really very different, often very different content. And if you do want to know what I had for supper, you don't really need to know. But please follow my public content and just click follow. My author page is lydiamcgrew.com. You're also welcome to email me. Please email me with questions, lydiamcgrew@gmail.com, or you can Facebook message me. The only thing is, if you're not my Facebook friend, I might not see it. I try to check the message requests from non-friends, but I don't always catch those, but I check my email obsessively. Do be sure to give me a brief introduction of yourself. I'd like to know whom I'm talking with, if you're a Christian, a non-believer, if you heard this seminar, or whatever, so that I just have a little bit of context. Okay, I am now going to click stop share, and we're going to go to Q&A. Thank you for your patience. This is a big topic, and we still haven't even said all we can say. Okay.
Well, thanks so much, Lydia. Folks, this is the interactive portion of the program. If you'd like to talk to Lydia about what you've heard, then please click the raise hand button at the top of your screen, and I'll promote you to be a co-panelist so you can have a live question with her, or you can also submit questions in textual form if you prefer, by hitting the Q&A button at the top of your screen. Please submit them there rather than in the live chat so that I don't miss them. There's a question here from Cody. Let me promote Cody to panelist.
Hello.
Hi, Cody.
Hello.
Hey, Cody.
Good to see you in person, sort of.
Good to see you.
Yes.
Virtual person.
Yes. So, yeah, fascinating chapter from your book was the evidence of the artless author. You can hear me fine, right?
And I can, but you can always be louder. From me, it's never too loud. My hearing isn't that great anyway, and I have a cold, so yeah.
Okay, just want to make sure. So the thing that fascinated me the most about that chapter was the section on the temple cleansing and the 46-year reference. You talk about how Herod began to rebuild the temple. I forget what the date was. Like, was it 20 or 19 BC? That's the whole argument is very fascinating and very convincing, actually. So I was talking to some friends about this, and maybe I'm wrong here, but like, didn't the second temple actually begin to be rebuilt like a few hundred years earlier or something, or are we just talking about maybe when Herod started to renovate the temple or something, or what do you mean by that?
I mean, it was really considered to be essentially a new temple, and Jonathan can probably address this even more than I can, but the other one was Herod considered it kind of pathetic, and Herod was a builder. He built to aggrandize himself. He built palaces and all kinds of things, and so just the mere fact that they're using the term 46 years shows that they are talking about the Herodian temple. And in fact, there's a place in I think it's right before the Olivet Discourse, where they're coming out of the temple, and so this is in the Synoptics, and they say, "Look what great stones are here!" So clearly they're admiring the grandeur of the Herodian temple. He cleared the space. It's like it was essentially a new building.
Okay. The other thing related to that is I'm wondering if maybe couldn't somebody who maybe who thinks that no, maybe the temple cleansing only happened once and it happened later. Couldn't they try to argue something like, well, yes, it took 46 years to rebuild, but that doesn't mean that the end of the 46 years is right at the beginning of the conversation that Jesus has with the people at the temple? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know what you're saying, but it's the way that they say it. They say it has taken 46 years, and so a lot of interpreters do actually take that to mean that they're saying, like, right now, we're at the point where it has taken, and in fact, here's the other thing. It's not done yet by then. We know that historically. We know historically that it's not like it was finished within the next 3 years. I mean, they were still fiddling around with that thing. I forget for how many more years. So that's another reason why it's not like there was something special about those 3 years that it got finished in there or something like that. That's another reason not to take it in that way.
Okay, that's very interesting. I don't know how many other people are waiting, but is it okay if I just ask one more question?
Sure, one more. Go for it.
This is about Plutarch. So as you know, Lacona and others, they argue that, John changed the day of the crucifixion from a different day. And so I was just wondering if you could just comment about, because Lacona, as you know, in his book makes the argument that he claims that Plutarch, right, changed the day of Caesar weeping at the statue. Apparently, the way Plutarch narrates it is different from how I think it's Suetonius and Cassius Dio. I hope I'm pronouncing his name.
Yeah, Dio Cassius, yeah.
Yeah, he claims that Plutarch changed the day, and he kind of uses that as a way to bolster the idea that maybe John could have done it. He even quotes Christopher Pelling as saying, I believe Plutarch may be up to something in that. I was wondering if you could just comment on that.
Sure, and Craig Keener makes the same argument as well. So, interestingly enough, that one about Alexander and Caesar didn't make it into the Mirror of the Mask. So people it's 546 pages long, and I'm already getting, it's too long, and it's like, well, yeah, but I couldn't say everything, so that one didn't make it in there, but it's supposed to be 7 years. And so Caesar was in Spain twice. He had 2 different trips to Spain, about 7 years apart. Suetonius and Cassius Dio are other historians. One of them is later than Plutarch, one of them is a contemporary of his, and they seem to be narrating it as occurring at the earlier of Caesar's visits to Spain, that he wept at a statue of Alexander the Great because he said, by my age, Alexander the Great had done so much more than I have done, and I have, my career hasn't really taken off or whatever, and so then Plutarch narrates that same incident, but appears, and again, it's not absolute, it could be an achronological narration, but I'm willing to accept that the most plausible reading of Plutarch there is that he is narrating it as occurring at the second visit to Spain. He just uses the phrase while he was in Spain, but he's just been talking about that visit to Spain and tells that same incident. So there is an apparent discrepancy. So here's your discrepancy hunting method at work. Because the funny thing is, it's just like, boom, they're different. And Pelling thinks it looks like there's an argument that the other 2 guys are right and Plutarch's wrong, which, there is some argument there and it's not knockdown, but okay, boom, Plutarch moved it. Whoa, why take it that Plutarch moved it deliberately? I mean, you just jumped over these, these other options. Like, for example, he made a mistake. Like, why should we take it that he's got, some other source open in front of him that says he did it on his first visit to Spain, and he goes, I shall move it to his second visit to Spain. There's nothing about being a classicist that gives you mind reading powers so that you can just tell that he moved it on purpose. Now, that's the main unique thing you're talking about. And I can also talk a little bit about the other arguments that John moved the day of the crucifixion, but there might be other people waiting as well.
Yeah, no, I was just asking specifically just about the Plutarch.
The Plutarch, okay, cool.
Yeah, the final comment I'll just make before I go is it's interesting how Lacona, he'll say that when he did this study, he said he claimed to have found the same type of differences that you see in the Gospels versus Plutarch. And what struck me, having gone through a lot of the examples in your book and all that, is in a sense, he's probably right. The caveat being, of course, is just as the discrepancy hunting method is bad and doesn't really work for the Gospels, it also doesn't seem to work for Plutarch either.
That's exactly right. What you're finding are apparent discrepancies. Well, yeah, history is full of apparent discrepancies. It's normal for history to have apparent discrepancies. If we applied these methods, we would erase all of the normal apparent discrepancies in history. Everything would become a literary device if we were consistent with it, which has got to be wrong. So what he's finding are the same types of apparent discrepancies. That's not the same thing as finding literary devices. So yes, I agree with you there.
Yes. Oh, well.
Cool.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cody. Okay, then folks that are watching on YouTube can also submit questions by entering questions into the YouTube live stream chat, and I'll receive them there as well. And we'll submit questions that way. We have a couple of questions that were submitted, or future questions that were submitted in text form. But first, I just want to ask one of my own questions, which is in the Gospel of Matthew, when he presents his genealogy of Jesus, he groups the genealogies into groups of 14. From Adam to David, David to the exile, and the exile to Christ. So there were 14 generations from to David and so forth. And we know that he has to skip over genealogies to make the math work out. And the reason that he is grouping them into blocks of 14 is to represent Jesus as the new David, because 14 is the numerical value of David's name, I would argue. In what sense would you draw a distinction between the sorts of literary devices you're talking about and this sort of mathematical literary device where he's deliberately skipping over generations to make the math work out at 14, but doing so in order to communicate something about Jesus being the creator of David?
So the first question I want to ask is, and you can set me straight on this if I've got this wrong, Jonathan. Does he skip or does he duplicate? Because I seem to recall that he duplicates Jeconiah, and that makes it come out to 14 just by counting Jeconiah twice.
Yeah, that might be true. I don't remember off the top of my head, but
and that there is somewhat of a difference there, just counting a guy twice, because, and I believe Norm Geisler discusses this in the big book of Bible difficulties, that it's from this to the exile, or to Jeconiah is 14, and then from the exile, because Jeconiah lives on into the exile, you count Jeconiah twice, so that's interesting.
I'm really sure that he skips genealogies as well. I don't have specific examples to hand.
Okay. First of all, we need to note, and you may not like this, but that it's uncertain that Matthew's doing that. I mean, at a minimum, that is a conjecture. It's something that may be true, and I'm not committed to its not being true, but it is a theory. So it's always real important epistemologically not to take something that's a theory, give it functionally probability 1, and then everybody else has to treat it as an absolute given. So we need to start with that right there. Second of all, son of in the genealogy obviously doesn't have to mean immediate, or of, who was of, or who was son of, doesn't have to mean immediate descendant, because right at the beginning, he says the son of God, the son of David, Jesus, the son of David. And obviously, Jesus wasn't the immediate son of David. Okay, so the begatting, as it were, that's taking place there, you can tell right away, need not be a gapless begatting, and you can tell that right in the first verse in a way that is a kind of tag right there in the text. The emphasis upon 14 is also a kind of tag in the text. You keep saying 14, it was 14, it was 14. So if he's doing what you take him to be doing, he seems to be drawing attention to it rather than trying to make it invisible and trying to make it deliberately appear contrary to fact. For those who want to count these things. So, and also if he's counting Jeconiah twice, that would again be obvious, because someone could go and count them and they could go, well, you're not going to get 14 unless you count him again. I mean, that's what we're doing, right? We're going in there, we're actually counting them. So that again is not an attempt to hide what he's doing, that he does actually appear to be counting Jeconiah twice. And I think a problem that arises here is just a really vague, broad term like literary artistry. That's the term that Dr. Lacona uses for that very example. Matthew uses literary artistry. Well, I think it should be obvious to anyone that the phrase literary artistry can mean a lot of different things. So we need to ask what is meant by that. And I would say that if that's what Matthew's doing, he's pointing to it in a number of different ways, and using figures of speech such as he begat or the son of in a more ordinary sense of the word, more like what, a light bulb in my head or something like that would be.
So I completely agree with you that son of or begat so and so can refer to immediate descendancy, or it can refer to descendancy with gaps in the genealogies. So that was not in contention. But when it's in Matthew, when it groups them into 14, it says that there were 14 generations from Adam to David, 14 from David to the exile, 14 from exile to Christ. There were duplicated generations, and there were also skipped generations. And so it wasn't really 14 generations in each of those divisions. Even though it's completely within the bounds of the meaning of the text for generations to be skipped, when he says there were 14 generations, that is actually factually false. But it seems that the ancients often use numbers symbolically rather than literally. I mean, there's other examples in the Bible as well, I think, where numbers are used symbolically.
Well, I'm not sure I'm always going to agree with you about all of those, but in this particular one, if that's what he's doing, once again, this is uncertain, but if that's what he's doing, then he, I would argue, expects to be understood to be doing that in that passage, rather than trying in his story world to portray it as if it really happened this way, contrary to fact. And so, it's kind of a counterfactual, maybe that's not even really what he's doing. Maybe he just miscounted, sorry. I mean, we do have to follow the evidence, and that is a possibility we shouldn't be afraid of. But if he's really deliberately doing it, then he is apparently trying to draw attention to some kind of symbolic use by the repeated use of 14 and by the double counting of the one person, which again, it's right there. I mean, you don't even have to look up for that one. You don't even have to look up another passage. You can just see that you have to double count that one, if I recall correctly, to get the right number.
Okay. Let's go to some of our submitted questions then. Lisa asked, you say you're not an inerrantist. Could you unpack that a bit?
Sure. So first of all, I mean, there's two possible meanings of inerrantist. There's, Jonathan and I were talking about this before we started, what could be called an a priori inerrantist. An a priori inerrantist says, it is a matter of theology that, which I accept. This person says that there can be no errors in the Bible, and I'm definitely not an a priori inerrantist. Another kind would be just an inductive inerrantist, is a person who says, I don't think there are any errors in the Bible. And, that kind of person could be an inerrantist in that sense about a secular document. I just don't think there are any errors in this book. I would not call myself either of those, though, because even in the Gospels, for which I consider there to be very high reliability, there are a few places where I think it's plausible that there are errors. I would call them trivial. I don't ask others necessarily to just take my word on that. I'll give an example here. It seems to me plausible that in the Passion Week, when Jesus' feet are anointed, that John may have made a small mistake about whether it was the night before Jesus' triumphal entry, which would have been a Saturday, or whether it was a Wednesday, which appears to be what is narrated in Mark. Now, I discussed this in The Mirror or the Mask. There are some very ingenious attempts here to treat Mark as narrating achronologically. I'm just not wholly convinced, but this is like the example I gave with my witness on the stand. Jesus had dinner at Bethany several nights in a row that week, in the town of Bethany, very small town, probably not all of them at Mary and Martha's house. And I think it would have been very easy quite a number of years later to just misremember which night it was when Mary of Bethany anointed his feet. So that's an example. I have other examples. I have not studied Old Testament alleged contradictions as much, so I don't want to make any strong statement there. There are some that I know of that I don't really see as a big deal. Was it, what is it? Who was it that moved David to number the people? Was it the devil or not? Well, there can be more than one cause and that kind of thing. And I do have some real questions about the Canaanite slaughters. That's probably my most controversial view in this. So that kind of unpacks it for you. I don't believe in hiding things from people. But the other thing I want to say is that there is nothing in my argument against literary device theory that depends upon denying inerrancy. In fact, overall, my case would support inductive inerrancy. And so if you are an old-fashioned inerrantist, please do not think, oh, if I agree with Lydia, I either have to agree with the literary device theorists or I have to deny inerrancy. That is absolutely not true. And this is why a number of very old-fashioned inerrantists, John Warwick Montgomery and Phil Fernandez of the International Society for Christian Apologetics. Norm Geisler was actually going to endorse my book, but he passed away before he could do so. And others have been very strongly in favor of my work because they see me as an ally and they appreciate my honesty in calling myself not an inerrantist, but they don't think that threatens what we actually agree upon in affirming the high reliability of the Gospels.
Bob Miller asks, is there a difference between the reportage model and model of jurisprudence? Testimony attributed by the rules of legal evidence, a la Greenleaf et al.
So can you repeat that? I got it. Is there a difference between the reportage model and that's where I lost you.
Is there a difference between the reportage model and model of jurisprudence? Testimony is reviewed by the rules of legal evidence, a la Greenleaf et al.
Gotcha. A jurisprudence model. Well, jurisprudence usually has to do with things like standards by which we evaluate testimony, whereas the reportage model is a statement. It's like what you might almost call a historical or metaphysical statement about what these texts are. So it's a conclusion we come to. We might use standards of evidence from jurisprudence that might help us to come to that conclusion. We might say they stand up to these examinations and so forth. But you could think of jurisprudence as a kind of a tool and for coming to a conclusion about the nature of the documents. And then you could think of the reportage model as a statement about the nature of the documents.
Very good. And folks, if we could keep the questions related to the topic, that would be great. We're not talking about abiogenesis.
Maybe somebody's asking what I had for dinner. No, I'm kidding.
Mike Winger asks, has the Kona's work contributed anything to our knowledge of non-fictionalizing literary devices?
No. That's the short answer. Non-fictionalizing devices are not literary. Let's just start there. They occur in non-literary contexts, and they are not new. They are harmonization. They are not an alternative to harmonization. And they are sometimes, unfortunately, presented as an alternative to harmonization. And that's not true. Harmonizers you see, from Augustine, uses achronological narration. So that's not a contribution. Achronological narration is a tool of harmonization, or the attribution of that to the author. Licona has coined the word spotlighting, and that's fine as a word. This is this idea that sometimes you talk about, there are more people involved, but sometimes you only talk about one of them. Well, that's fine. There were multiple angels at the tomb, but an author might just talk about one angel. There were multiple demoniacs, but the author might just talk about one demoniac, and so forth. That, again, is a form of harmonization. It is not an alternative to harmonization. So in a sense, what's, I'm afraid, happening here is that these things that we're already known about are being what I call co-opted. That grabbing them, giving them a name, and then saying, well, that's what I'm talking about. And then people say, oh, well, that's no problem. And then when somebody like me comes along and says, there's some problems with what's in this book, it's like, well, what kind of a weirdo are you that you deny spotlighting? And maybe they don't even go read what I've written, or something, and then they assume that all that is being done are non-fact changing literary devices. Of course, if that were true, we wouldn't need to talk about crafting new glasses. We wouldn't need to talk about crafting new lenses. So I would say absolutely not. If it were just non-fact changing so-called devices, a book by Oxford University Press in 2017 would have been completely extraneous and unnecessary.
We have a question from Dustin, who I'm going to promote to panelist.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
This is Josh Brister, by the way. My question related to, and I'm trying to figure this out. Your latest book and the one before it, are you saying criteria such as the criteria of authenticity should not be used as, for example, as William Lane Craig charged Bert Ehrman as doing, as negative criteria? That is to say that unless they meet these various criteria, historical criteria, they're presumed to be not historical. So would you say the different criteria for establishing something historical, we can still use these various criteria, but we should not in and of itself be skeptical, even if a particular passage doesn't meet these standards of historicity? I hope I'm being clear.
Oh, you're being very clear. That's an excellent question. That is a question I address at length in The Eye of the Beholder that's coming up. So here, this is a preview of a chapter in The Eye of the Beholder. I'm certainly saying at least that, but I'm actually saying more than that. There is yet another way, functionally, to use the criteria negatively that, unfortunately, many evangelical scholars do not recognize as a negative use. And that is that if something doesn't so-called meet the criteria, we treat it as ambiguous, or we treat it as having a question mark over it. So we don't say it's unhistorical, we don't reject it, but we say, well, it hasn't met these stringent standards, so we can't assert it. Like it doesn't meet what we might call assertability conditions for a historian.
Yeah.
And that's wrong too. That's also wrong. So you'll notice that in my list of support for the reportage model, I didn't list a single one of the criteria. So I'm trying to break out of that model in even a more radical way and hugely supplement with all this other stuff. And I would also say that in particular, what's called the criterion of double dissimilarity is just bad. Don't use that one at all. I mean, especially if you think of it as, okay, I'll modify that a little bit. Especially if you call it the criterion of historical plausibility. I think it came to be renamed as I was reading. That's a terrible name for it. Now, you might fit in that Jesus used Abba, Father, because it's doubly dissimilar. So, okay, couple things might fit there, but the notion that this is a criterion of historical plausibility automatically introduces doubts about anything that isn't doubly dissimilar. And double dissimilarity means it has to be dissimilar from Christian teaching. Well, what does that mean? That would mean if it's historically implausible, if it doesn't meet this criterion, then Jesus never taught any Christian teaching. It's like, it doesn't cut against the grain of later Christian theologizing. Well, that's how we end up denying or questioning the unique I am sayings and the unique claims to deity in John. So I'm going to go so far as to say this: unless you radically supplement the criteria of authenticity, even used positively, one, radically supplement, and two, have as an explicit self-conscious goal to demonstrate non-deductively the reliability of an entire gospel in a high, robust way, what you might think of as a positive use of the criteria will psychologically and sociologically inevitably fall into being functionally a negative use of the criteria. And I would say we've seen that happen. And it's a very important problem actually in modern evangelical criticism, where they've internalized these as, oh, these are the highest standards. And then they'll say, well, I'm believing beyond the evidence because I'm believing things that can't be shown by the criteria. Well, who says the criteria are the only evidence that by which something can be shown? So yes, I'm definitely saying we shouldn't use them negatively, but I'm also saying there's more ways than one to use them negatively.
Okay. Jonathan, would it be, or both you and Jonathan, would it be okay if I ask a question about form criticism?
Form criticism. Sure, you can ask a follow-up.
I've been reading Richard Bauckham and N.T. Wright, especially Richard Bauckham, that makes this point that Bultmann and others presumed that there was an evolution to the form criticism model of gospel passages, and he likes to say that there were eyewitnesses still alive when these things were being written, so a living history. Do you think we should accept that model rather than the anonymous form critical approach of Rudolf Bultmann?
Yes, absolutely. I would say that. And once again, as with the other question, I would go even further. Richard Bauckham announces the death of form criticism. I believe he has that in both editions of Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and I think he even has in the second edition something like, yes, form criticism really is dead, because he said he was surprised himself to come to such a radical conclusion. Now, he says something very interesting there. He says, and other types of criticism, such as redaction criticism, often take the assumptions of form criticism as an assumption and a basis as well. So he says this is going to affect other kinds of criticism as well. Now, Bauckham doesn't expound upon that. He doesn't talk about that. But I can see how that's true. And I've seen a lot of people, they will be out there, and it's not considered too conservative right now to be out there announcing the death of form criticism. Hurrah, hurrah. Jimmy Dunn and Richard Bauckham and N.T. Wright and the death of form criticism. Yay, I can still be a moderate and say this. And now nobody's going to consider me too conservative. But then when we get to certain theses about redaction criticism, well, Matthew was just working with Mark, and then he just added this, and he didn't have any factual basis for it. That's let pass without a question. And to question that is considered to be too radically conservative. Well, I would question those uses of redaction criticism as well, because quite frankly, I don't think they're taking the eyewitness model nearly seriously enough. If Matthew, and this also may arise partly from the fact that Bauckham does not believe in Matthew authorship. He doesn't believe in the Matthew's authorship of Matthew. But if Matthew actually was an eyewitness, and he adds a detail, even in a passage where he is seeming to possibly use Mark as what we call, maybe a pony or something, because he doesn't want to write everything himself, we shouldn't assume that he doesn't have factual justification for that detail. So I would take an even stronger view of the controlling nature that eyewitness testimony placed upon what was recorded as in my reportage model.
How do you think, and this is my last, I'll quit bothering, but how do you think, like the Jerusalem Council in AD 49, how do you think that played as like a control on the tradition? Living eyewitnesses could control it rather, could you go into that any?
Well, of course, they were addressing a really specific question of ethics, and a question of ethics that Jesus himself had never addressed. Jesus had certainly implied that the Gentiles would be brought into the kingdom. There are several parables that imply that, and he even said concerning the centurion, many will come down and come and sit at the table with Abraham and so forth from the east and from the west, but he never spelled out how that was going to work out. Do they have to keep kosher? Do they have to be circumcised and so forth? And then partly through the vision of Peter and the conversion of Cornelius, partly through the mission of Paul to the Gentiles, suddenly we had this enormous practical problem. And that's what they're addressing there. So I don't know whether they discussed any of this, at that time at all. Well, I think it mostly just shows us that they were working consciously together to retain a kind of unity in the new budding church.
Okay. Yeah, it does seem like if they're that, they think it's such an important thing to make sure these theological questions are understood. Surely, this is my view, that they would want to have a general, layout of the different Jesus stories and the accuracy and so forth.
I could see that as evidence for their desire for accuracy in the stories. It's an indirect argument, but it has value. I mean, there are people who would deny the connection. They'd say, oh no, they were more concerned about theology and practice than they were about historical accuracy, ancient views of truth and all that. But I would tend to say that what you're saying is not unreasonable. I think we're going to move on to somebody else now.
Thank you.
Thanks, Josh.
Well, thank you. Okay, so we have a couple of submitted questions. An anonymous attendee asks, what briefly is your response to the claim that these literary devices like transferal, displacement, and inflection are taught to aspiring historians in books like the Progymnasia of Aelius Theon?
Yep, the Progymnasmata. So that's a whole class of evidence, and I have a whole chapter on that. And it's wow, it's just amazing how incorrect the interpretations are. So I'm gonna address inflection right here. I have some notes about this here. So inflection is supposedly this idea that the authors felt free to change the number of people who were involved, singular to plural and plural to singular. So Dr. Licona seems to imply in Why Are There Differences in the Gospels that inflection was a literary device. And Dr. Craig Keener definitely takes him that same way. In Christobiography, he uses this as a justification for the idea of adding blind men, which I mentioned in my presentation, adding blind men to certain incidents where they weren't present. And that he already believed that back in his Matthew commentary, but that was some years ago. And then Licona's book was published in between. And now in Christobiography, he cites Licona's book and calls it inflection. And if you go to the actual, exercise book, here would be an exercise. Theon talks about there are three numbers in Greek. There's singular, the dual, which is exactly 2, and there's the plural. We may do this in several ways. Is one person speaking about one or two more? If the krea, he calls it, meaning in this case a saying, is that Isocrates, the orator, said that those with natural ability are the children of the gods, we inflect it by saying Isocrates, the orator, said that the student with natural ability was a child of gods. And as of 2, the twin orators, Isocrates, said that the twin students with natural abilities are children of the gods. And as of plural, the orators, Isocrates, said that the students with natural abilities are the children of gods. From these examples, it is evident how we shall inflect the other forms for the original statements are changed into the 5 grammatical cases. This is a grammatical exercise. This has nothing, I repeat, nothing to do with altering history to say that, no student who did that grammatical exercise is going to think that you could write a serious history in which you said there were twin orators named Isocrates and try to convince people because you're using the literary device of inflection. This is a blunder. This is just, frankly, it's an enormous blunder. And Dr. Keener just adopts it, apparently uncritically, from Dr. Licona. Of course, he thought it already, and didn't have a good argument for it in Matthew commentary either. But to suggest that it accounts for Marx omitting Marx omitting a second figure, or as I think perhaps more likely, Matthew doubling a Markan figure to compensate. And then another thing that's used to argue that this was a literary device is that Plutarch in one life depicts the reaction of Cato's sisters, but in another, the same reaction of his singular sister. Well, if Cato had more than one sister, then, and if they all reacted in the same way, then Plutarch could just talk about his sisters in one and his sister in the other. Obviously, you're inflecting the noun in the trivial sense that one is singular and one is plural, but that does not mean that you're changing the number of people involved. So that's just a, that's just a mistake. And I go through many different examples. So embellishment and paraphrase and adding dialogue. I go through adding dialogue as a supposed literary device and moving a saying, putting it in another category. So for another context. So for example, supposedly these exercises taught you to that it was okay to take a saying, maybe a saying Jesus said in one place, and to narrate it as if he said it in a completely different place and time. And then an example that's given for this is putting a maxim on the end of a fable. So you tell a fable, and then at the end you have this little, and the moral of the story. That has nothing to do with taking a saying and moving it to a different time. So these are just exercises for purposes of teaching good writing. Now, or rhetoric, or even logic, these being trained to be writers and rhetoricians. Now, Dr. Licona does quote a place where Theon says he's, advertising his curriculum. We all do this. My curriculum is good for, anybody who's writing, including this, and historians. Well, sure. Historians need to be able to write well. Historians need to be able to write well. It does not mean that in that passage Theon is saying, and therefore my curriculum is telling historians about when it's okay to change the facts. He's actually not addressing that issue at all. I've read the entire Pro Gymnasmata. He doesn't address that question at all. So this is important, and this is something that you can see for yourself. There's not some deep esoteric code that if you take the Greek and you heat it up under a lamp or something, the lemon juice is going to heat up and you're going to see something that, now he's telling them this. There's nothing, some kind of secret knowledge here. You go and you read it and you say, wow, this is a mistake. One of my endorsers, John DePoe, is a philosopher who teaches at a classical high school right now. They teach a modern form of the Pro Gymnasmata, and he was quite astounded at this misunderstanding of the meaning of a writing curriculum. If you have a writing curriculum and you say, write a dialogue in which, between George Washington and a soldier at Valley Forge, that doesn't mean you're giving historiographical advice about making up dialogue in a serious history. So it's a good question.
Thanks. There's also a question from Slam RN on YouTube. Why did you write the book rather than going to the literary theorists and talking about it, or did you?
Going to them and talking about it. Well, there were various things that happened. I wrote some blog posts. I've actually had some correspondence personally with Craig Keener. I've had some correspondence personally with William Lane Craig about these things, and I've had a debate with Craig Evans on the Unbelievable show because he agreed to it. I attempted to have a dialogue with Michael Licona. I had begun writing, I had written, I forget how much of a series of scholarly blog posts. I did not expect it to turn into a book. And maybe I'd finished that series. Anyway, and Philosophy of Christie, at that time under the editorship of Craig Hazen, offered us space to have a scholarly exchange about this. And Justin Brierley also offered us space on the Unbelievable show. I myself actually think the Philosophy of Christie route would have been, very appropriate. It's a highly esteemed philosophy of religion journal, and Dr. Licona refused. So he's repeatedly, and Tom Gilson urged him to engage and so forth, and he stated to Tom that he did not intend to, and he asked Tom to make that public, actually. So there were various ways in which I both did engage with some, attempted to engage with others unsuccessfully. And one of the complaints that was made was, this is on the internet. You shouldn't be doing this on the internet. The internet is the wrong place, etc. Well, we had offered Philosophy of Christie, which is not an internet venue. That was also rejected. So at that point, I did approach my publisher who had published Hidden in Plain View, and he was open to doing a book. So I think that answers the question. Tim has also discussed these things on one occasion with Dr. Licona as well.
Michael Licona is active in promoting his views on the internet also. So
I'm sorry, say again?
Michael Licona is also active in promoting his perspective on the internet also. So.
To some extent. I mean, certainly Kurt Yaros did a few posts about me in the summer of 2018. He's posted some things, and Kurt Yaros is a newly minted New Testament PhD. Congratulations on that, and who agrees with Dr. Licona, and he's put, Facebook posts as well. In general, Dr. Licona has not done a whole lot of direct responding to me. Very brief. He's made some negative comments, like most recently, very brief negative comments on David Wood's show.
Yeah, what I meant was that he's been promoting his perspective on literary devices on the internet. So why should you not be able to promote the counter view also on the internet?
Right. So you're talking about things like debates he does with Bart Ehrman. He brought it up there, or we had a written debate, and he's posted his lectures. He posted his lectures. In fact, his lectures on the internet were the way I first became aware, because they came out before his book. So they were on the internet. I take it that the argument was that the internet was a wrong place for me to be disagreeing with a fellow Christian scholar. I take it that that was the argument.
But then if the internet is where lay apologists are going to gather information, and they go on and it's all Michael Licona and people that subscribe to his perspective, then it seems only fair that we hear the counter perspective in a venue where they're likely to access it.
I agree with that, and I particularly agree, now that I have written the book, it's interesting, this very strange and I would say quite artificial book internet distinction is apparently being applied to me in a particularly strong way. There was a public comment, and it's public, it's out there, and I'm trying to remember whose wall it's on, but it was set to public, and I think it was on Kurt Jaros's wall. But Dr. Licona said something like, if Lydia had done what most scholars do, which is to write a book and then just leave it at that, there wouldn't necessarily be a reason to answer here on Facebook, but she's made a crusade out of this. I mean, that's not really true. When scholars write books, they promote their books on the internet. I mean, we live in the social media age. When you write a book, so apparently I was supposed to write a book, and then I was supposed to let it gather dust somewhere, and I wasn't supposed to go on Facebook and say, hey, check out my book, or here's an answer to something that's been said by the people I disagree with. Here's a further answer because I didn't know they were going to say this, so now I'm answering it on Facebook. I wasn't supposed to interact even after I wrote a book. I was supposed to book only, non-internet only. That does not make sense. That's extremely artificial, and I see no ethical, moral, scriptural, anything argument for such a set of principles.
Yep, I agree. Any other questions? Who want to submit? How much longer do you have, Lydia? Do you want to wrap up? Or do you
So my voice isn't gone yet, and I still have water. So if a couple of people would like to, I don't want people to feel like it's just dragging on, but if a couple other questions come up, or you have a couple things you'd like to discuss for a few minutes longer, I think we can do that.
Okay, let's give it a few minutes and see if any more questions come in. Okay, we have a question from Joel. How much have you investigated undesigned coincidences, unnecessary casual details, or variations in the Old Testament? And do you think these evidences of reliable testimony are comparable to what we find in the Gospels in any of the historic books of the Old Testament? I know J. Blunt discusses this, but I have not looked into it myself.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I haven't done anything that I can think of right now with unexplained allusions. Personalities I have thought about, Jacob in particular. My goodness, I mean, it's absolutely remarkable how vivid a personality Jacob is. And here, if we take traditional authorship, Moses is writing this, obviously hundreds of years later. And so there you really do have evidence of very stable tradition of some kind. And I don't know if it could have been a written document or what, and Laban as well. The personalities of these people they just pop. Several of those Old Testament characters. Undesigned coincidences, I did start making a list of them, and they're fascinating. And I think there are quite a number of good ones. I don't diss them. My main reason for not doing a follow-up book, besides that I got really involved in this material on undesigned coincidences in the Old Testament, is questions about authorship. And I don't mean liberal questions about authorship. I mean just unknown questions, even with conservatives. So it's useful to be able to at least say, now you can have undesigned coincidences within the work of a single author, but it's also good to be able to say whether you consider this to be occurring within a single author's work. But I don't know whether the same guy who wrote 1 Samuel is the same guy who wrote 2 Samuel. So sometimes we have chronologists, chronographers, whatever those are called, people who are keeping some kind of royal records that are being assembled. You have multiple authors, and I'm not talking about some crazy JEPD theory or something, but just in a very ordinary kind of sense. So you're not going to be able to draw the same conclusions. Like, this author appears to be a really reliable guy, that you can about Luke, because each one of the Gospels it's very distinctively the mark of an individual mind. I think that any attempt to postulate some kind of extremely active co-author or so-called amanuensis. I'm not saying they didn't have an amanuensis in the more minimal sense, but extremely active co-author who was introducing literary devices or something. That just doesn't make sense at all. I think each of them is stylistically and in terms of emphasis and personality clearly the mark of a single person. So then when we find them confirmed, then we go, okay, what are these people like? That's a great source for having confidence in the reliability of the whole book. But when you're not sure who the author was, or whether there might have been, just in the ordinary course of events, multiple authors, you can't draw quite as strong conclusions. This is also related, of course, to the fact that the coincidences are spread over much longer periods of time, hundreds of years in some cases, which is what makes them less intuitive for some people. So it might be something like the prohibition on horses in Israel. They couldn't own horses, and then you find all these references to them riding on donkeys. So it's not a confirmation of like one highly specific event. It's a confirmation of an overall cultural practice resulting from a command of God, and people don't find those quite as intuitive. So I'm not here to diss undesigned coincidences in the Old Testament. I just don't think they're going to operate in exactly the same way.
Yeah, I've done quite a bit of study on that topic, and I find quite a number are very compelling. For example, 2 Samuel 15, where you have Absalom rebelling against his father, King David.
I like that one.
Ahithophel the Gilonite is sent for by Absalom, and you wonder, who's Ahithophel the Gilonite? Well, he's David's most trusted counselor. And in fact, in chapter 16, it says that in those days, Ahithophel's counsel was so esteemed by David that when he consulted his counsel, it was as though he was consulting the word of God. That's how much he trusted Ahithophel. And so the question arises, why is Absalom counting on Ahithophel to join him in the conspiracy against King David? And why is Ahithophel so quick to turn on David? We flip over to chapter 23, a completely different context, where it lists 37 bodyguards of King David. And two individuals stand out. One is Uriah the Hittite, and one is Eliam, the son of Ahithophel the Gilonite.
Yep.
So who are those individuals? Well, Uriah, we learn from chapter 11, turns out to be the husband of Bathsheba. And because King David's strolling along his palace roof, he sees Bathsheba bathing, and he asks, who is this? And he's told that this is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And that makes sense, of course, because if Uriah and Eliam are colleagues, then you can imagine that Eliam introduces Uriah to his daughter Bathsheba, and they end up getting married. And then that also illuminates why Ahithophel's quick to turn on David, because he's the grandfather of Bathsheba and the grandfather-in-law of Uriah. And so David is committed adultery with his granddaughter and murdered his grandson-in-law. And then it also illuminates chapter 16 of 2 Samuel, because Ahithophel asks Absalom for counsel on what he should do. And he's told, go in and pitch a tent on the roof of the palace and go in and have his concubines in the sight of all Israel. Why pick the roof to do so? Well, because that's where David's lustful eye first caught Bathsheba bathing.
Although that could also just be because it's such an insult. I mean, there's that too. It's very, very horrible insult for everyone to see it, but no, I like that one a lot. That's one of my favorites. I also like the one about if I have this name right, Joab, the general, and how rude he is to David at a certain point, and how he's constantly, like David's mourning over Absalom. He kills Absalom against David's orders, and then he comes and he says, "Get up, get out there," and he just treats him really badly. Well, he was the instrument of the death of Uriah, and Blunt says he lost all respect for David at this point. And then after when David's dying, he warns Solomon about him, and then Solomon just has him killed. I mean, my daughter always says it's like The Godfather, and Blunt says, Solomon had no guilty conscience in connection to him. He hadn't carried out his, unethical orders, so he has no qualms. He has him killed, but he develops power over David and loses respect for him. So there are a lot of really good ones. I've made some lists of these, actually, the ones that I especially appreciate.
Yeah. What do you think that you can make an inductive argument from the testimony of Jesus, having established his resurrection from the dead and therefore his messianic and divine credentials, and given that he has a high view of the Old Testament, we can inductively argue for a high view of the Old Testament indirectly on that basis?
I think to some extent you can, and I'm certainly for sure going to apply that to the theological teachings of the Old Testament, because Jesus goes farther than just saying something generally positive. He uses the creation of Adam and Eve and the institution of marriage by God. And for this cause, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, as foundation for his own teaching on divorce. So Jesus is definitely taking that to support, it's like that's his authority. Now, whether this is going to support, every statement about who fell in battle where, I don't know that I would go that far, but certainly in some important and very significant sense, and I know that sounds like a weasel phrase, but it's the best I can do right now, a high view of the Old Testament.
Okay, a few more questions came in. Actually, two more questions. Cody says, are you aware of any other religious texts or secular documents that could have undesigned coincidences?
No. His allegedly historical religious texts, no. And I've even been looking for them in modern literature, and I find that kind of an interesting thing to do. And I've had trouble finding them even as designed. I mean, they wouldn't be undesigned in that case, they would be designed, but that appear undesigned. Even in modern realistic fiction, I've found one.
He also asked about secular documents, and I know that Tim has compiled a list
yes,
of their use in secular history. Although
yep, and they even use that phrase. One that I found in, I found one in Plutarch actually that I kind of like, at least one. I think I may mention two in the Mirror of the Mask, but one concerns the brother of Cicero, who was injured in some rioting while Cicero was in exile. And the rioting was seen as sort of a general dissolution of society because wonderful Cicero wasn't around, you know, with his wisdom and so forth. And so they're going to bring Cicero back from exile. And there's this guy named Clodius who doesn't want Cicero brought back. So at a certain point, I believe it's Pompey who's been kind of dithering about what to do. He gets a big enough crowd, and they drive Clodius out of the forum, and then they vote right away to bring Cicero back from exile. And it says when they go into the forum, it mentions that they escort the brother of Cicero with them in this kind of expedition, you know, to drive out Clodius. Boy, you know, if we think our political stuff is exciting, you know, imagine what it would have been back then. I mean, they're actually literally fighting, you know, but physically, but it doesn't explain in that life why they escorted the brother of Cicero. And then, you know, just generally, well, he's Cicero's brother, you know, but then in the other life, it mentions that he had been injured and left for dead in the fighting in the forum at one point where there was some, you know, social upheaval. So he would have become a symbolic character in people's minds. You know, he's his loyal brother, and he was trying to get him brought back, and he got hurt in all this fighting, and now we're going to drive out these other guys and bring him in. I don't know if they literally carried him on their shoulders, but he would be a symbolic person for them to bring in that final confrontation. So there's an undesigned coincidence in Plutarch.
One thing I find really fascinating about the Gospels is that not only do we have numerous points of confirmation in terms of the undesigned coincidences and the extra biblical corroborations and the unexplained delusions and so forth, but we also see these remarkable points of contact with the Old Testament, and where you have these numerous points where the New Testament, the Gospel portrayals of Jesus correlate with types and shadows of the Old Testament, such as Jesus being crucified at the time of Passover, which would be something very difficult to engineer. And even if Jesus had viewed himself as a Messiah, it's unlikely he would have chosen the kind of Messiah that gets himself crucified by the Romans, rather than Simon Bar-Gura type of Messiah, where he leads a revolt against the Roman occupiers. The fact that we have both the numerous points of gospel confirmation and all these numerous correlations with the Old Testament seems to me to be quite remarkable, and points, I think, to the divine inspiration of the text and the divine orchestration of the history. Would you agree with that argument?
Well, I would want to see it in particular cases, but I remember one that you sent to me once that I thought was interesting that concerned 6 days before Passover. And I have an undesigned coincidence about that and hidden in plain view, that Jesus came to Bethany. He came to the vicinity there near Jerusalem on the Mount of slopes of the Mount of Olives. And I don't remember the whole chronology of the feast of the Passover, but you had a connection there with the selection, I think it was, of the Passover lamb. One thing I want to note there, though, is that it is important to your argument there that that is a literal number, that Jesus actually did come 6 days before Passover. So there, if that number is symbolic and orchestrated by God, it can't be symbolic as opposed to literal. And I think this definitely makes a distinction from any cute little thing that Matthew might be doing or might not be doing in the genealogy, because Matthew's not reporting an event like that. This is an event being reported, and John is full of these little times. Most of them, I think even you would agree, Jonathan, that most of them in John don't have any symbolic importance. It's just, this happened at the 10th hour, or there were this many water pots and they held this many gallons or whatever. And they're just being reported because they're true, and they're unnecessary. And you do find that in oral history. You talk to somebody with a really good memory, he'll just throw in all these unnecessary details. So, I think there are things, certainly obvious fulfillments of prophecy, like his legs weren't broken and so forth. As far as the more subtle ones, I would want to see those on a case-by-case basis, but I certainly think it could be possible.
So the argument in regards to the John 12 issue is that Jesus enters into Jerusalem as 5 days before Passover, because he enters Jerusalem the following day. And according to Exodus 12, the Jews were to select their Passover lamb and bring it into their homes exactly 5 days before Passover on the 10th of Nisan. And then, of course, that's not completely independent of Jesus' death at Passover, and so we have to take that into account when calculating or estimating the base factor. But even a base factor of 2 or 3 doubles or triples our cumulative base factor. So you've got Jesus' death at the time of Passover, the fact that and you've talked about this in one of your papers, the fact that he is crucified, as opposed to being stoned by the Jews or something.
Right.
And crucifixion fits very well with what we see in Psalm 22, which was interpreted by many Jews prior to Christ as a messianic psalm.
Yes, it was.
So you've got the fact Jesus is crucified, the fact that he happens to be crucified at the time of Passover, the fact that his entrance into Jerusalem is 5 days before Passover, and on the hypothesis that, so we've got 4 contending hypotheses. We've got 3 design hypotheses. One is that it's designed by the human authors. They manipulate the history to make it conform. Second, it's designed by God. Thirdly, it's designed by Jesus, and because he views himself as the Messiah. The problem with that is that if Jesus viewed himself as a Messiah, it's unlikely he'd choose the type of Messiah to get himself crucified by the Romans.
But he couldn't make Judas go on just a certain day. I mean, Judas goes voluntarily to them, and then they decide when they're going to, when they're going to capture him. I know it's this whole, Jesus is in control of his death because he tells him, what thou doest do quickly, but Judas is already planning to do it that night. Yeah. I think independently. So, and I wanted to say something here about this idea of the symbolism. And I just want people to take this away, because I didn't have time to address this statement that John moves the day of the crucifixion. Craig Blomberg makes this really, really important point. John, the evangelist, never mentions the Passover lambs in connection with Jesus' death. Not once. The mention of the Passover lamb in the Passion narrative occurs only in the Synoptics. It concerns the daytime before Jesus goes and they have the Last Supper. It says on the day when the Passover lambs were killed. They talked about where shall we keep the Passover and so forth. The mention of the Passover lambs is not even mentioned in John. Now, back when John the Baptist says, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, it's mentioned, but that's, several years before by John's own chronology. And so there's this, I think the more I think about it, the more bizarre it seems to me, incredibly bizarre theory that John the Evangelist is moving the day when Jesus is crucified in order to have him crucified on the same day, and some would even say the same time that the Passover lambs were killed, but not mentioning Passover lambs anywhere in the vicinity, probably writing after the fall of Jerusalem, when no Passover lambs were being killed anymore anyway, to a partially Gentile audience that didn't know anything about this stuff, or maybe knew very little about this stuff. What is this? Some kind of private little code? Oh, this is so cool. I'll change the facts and I'll make it happen this way. It's like what I think they call an Easter egg in modern movies or something. He's just doing it more or less for his own satisfaction. That is so implausible. And I just loved that point about his not mentioning Passover lambs. Only the Synoptics mention Passover lambs, and yet the theory is he made this change to make Jesus be the Passover lamb. Very improbable.
And I would actually argue that there's a reconcilable variation there, which is another criterion of historicity, because you've got the Jews in John's Gospel are concerned about entering Pilate's dwelling lest they should be defiled, and they want to be able to eat the Passover. But the problem is that if their concern was about the Seder of Passover, then their defilement would expire at sundown, and they could simply wash, and then they could eat the Passover meal. And so it must be some meal other than the Passover meal, probably the Feast of Unleavened Bread, around midday the following day, which Flavius Josephus tells us was also known as the Passover meal.
Yep.
So then it points, I think, to independent testimony.
Yep.
Relevant independence, which then corroborates that Jesus really was crucified on the day of Passover, which is a remarkable coincidence when you think about it. And in my article where I deal with this argument, which I call the argument for Messianic convergence, I assign that a base factor of 50, which I think is a fairly conservative base factor estimate. And then I give the fact that Jesus enters Jerusalem 5 days before Passover, something like a base factor of 2. And then which immediately doubles your cumulative base factor. And then you've also got the fact that all the earliest sources indicate that the first appearances of Jesus begin on the Sunday following Jesus' death. 1 Corinthians 15 is the earliest source, which mentions that he rose again on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. You've also got the change of Saturday observance, Sabbath observance, Sunday, the Lord's Day. So then if you look at Leviticus 23, the day in which the Jews were to celebrate or recognize the Feast of First Fruits was on the day following Sabbath, following Passover. And so that immediately points away from the honest mistaken hypothesis to design, either in the part of God designing Sunday as the day he would raise Jesus from the dead, or in the part of the human authors. But scholars are unanimous that the gospel authors were not, or that the apostles were not lying about the resurrection. They honestly believed that they'd had experiences in which Jesus had risen from the dead and appeared to them. And so it again adds to the cumulative case. So I would assign that again a low base factor of 2 or 3 because it was. Well,
and the other thing is you have to argue that what they believed was something robust, that what they were asserting was this robustly physical resurrection, because what scholars are unanimous about, I'm sorry to say, is not that they sincerely believed that they had had the kind of experiences that are reported in the Gospels. You'll find scholars that'll say, they believe that they'd had, some kind of experience, or that Jesus had arisen in some way. And this is why we go with a, maximal rather than a minimal case. So.
Also, you've got the fact that Christianity becomes the dominant world religion that it becomes, because that's something that's very surprising, because until 313 AD, where you have the Edict of Milan, Christianity is the persecuted minority. You have Roman emperors, powerful politicians, and governments trying to stamp out the Christian religion, destroy their scriptures. There's an enormous price to being a Christian, being fed to wild animals, being burned alive, being nailed to a cross, and so forth. So it's very surprising then that Christianity became the dominant world religion that it became. However, when you read the Old Testament, you read Isaiah or Zechariah or Daniel, etc., all of these texts and many others indicate that part of the Messiah's job description was to bring all the nations, representatives from all the nations, to a recognition and worship of the God of Israel. And so on the hypothesis Jesus it really is the Messiah, the probability of that happening is approximately equal to 1. But on the probability that, on the hypothesis Jesus is not who he claimed to be, the probability is far lower than that. So you've got a very top-heavy base factor there.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that. Did you come up with that one on your own, or did you get that one from Hugh Gouch?
That one I came up with on my own.
Okay, because it's in Hugh Gouch as well. I don't know if I ever sent you his on Messianic prophecy, but that's one of his arguments too. You should probably cite him, not as a source, but just as a predecessor or something. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, let's see. Let's take 3 quick ones. Can you give another illustration of reading Plutarch without invoking literary devices of the sort in question?
Reading Plutarch incorrectly to find the literary devices? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Okay, so like one that I disagree with. Okay, yeah, I'll give one more. And at that point, I think we should probably wind it up. So here's one. Were Antony and Octavian in the battle? So after Julius Caesar was assassinated, his friend Antony and his heir Octavian made war against the forces of 2 of the conspirators involved in the assassination, Brutus and Cassius. Lacona alleges some kind of discrepancy between two of Plutarch's lives about whether or not Octavian and Antony were personally present in one of the battles. So he says there's a difference pertaining to whether Antony and Octavian were present at the first battle. In this life, neither Antony nor Octavian were with their armies in the first battle. And then he says, let's see. However, in this life, Antony was victorious everywhere, and Caesar narrowly escaped secretly when his camp was overrun by Brutus. So he's saying that in the one life, in the life of Brutus, neither of them is with their armies, and in the life of Antony, they are both with their armies. And then what I say is that it's very striking that Plutarch expressly states in the very account where Lacona says that Antony was present in the battle, that some sources have claimed that Antony was not present. And something similar is true about Octavian. Plutarch doesn't even reject that claim. He reports it in a neutral fashion. And the phrase, Antony was everywhere victorious, does not have to mean, that's a general statement about how well things were going for Antony's troops, especially since Plutarch then says that some have reported that he wasn't present at this battle. He makes it clear that it does not necessarily mean that Antony was personally present. Here's a quotation from Plutarch. After they had crossed the sea, taken up war, and encamped near the enemy, Antony being opposed to Cassius and Caesar to Brutus, no great achievements were performed by Caesar. Notice this is a sort of broad summary. But it was Antony who was everywhere victorious and successful. In the first battle, at least, Caesar was overwhelmingly defeated by Brutus. Again, this is Caesar's side, lost his camp, and narrowly escaped his pursuers by secret flight, although he himself says in his memoirs that he withdrew before the battle in consequence of a friend's dream. But Antony conquered Cassius, though some write that Antony was not present in the battle, but came up after the battle when his men were already in pursuit. This is astonishing. He's claiming there's a discrepancy about whether they were present or not, and that in this one, they were definitely present. And Plutarch expressly states qualifiers to whether they were present. Just astonishing. There's at most a very slight difference of emphasis between them. So again, as I say, you can read these for yourself. This is not esoteric. What it chiefly took was legwork, hard legwork and time. If I were sloppy, I wouldn't have done all this work. I wouldn't have examined these things, and I wouldn't have done Dr. Lacona the courtesy of doing that, of taking his arguments with that much seriousness. But I wasn't sloppy, so I did. And so I invite readers to consider it for themselves. Don't take anybody else's word for it.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Lydia. It's been great.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you for having me, Jonathan.
Yep. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Good night.
Night.